To make sense of those numbers, our expert panel includes two of the state's most respected MPs, the Liberal Party's Transport Minister Gladys Berejiklian and Labor's former Deputy Leader Carmel Tebbit. I'm Chris Ullman, your host for Tonight.
And I'm Bridget Glanville. I've been on the campaign trail every day. Tonight I'll be talking to candidates across the state in the most crucial electorates at the very tipping point of this election contest. And of course, to keep us all at the very front of the count, the ABC's election analyst Anthony Green.
And tonight we're taking a direct feed of results from the Electoral Commission. We'll be getting those figures booth by booth, crunching them through the ABC's election computer system, turning them into the best and most immediate trends. We'll know the result before anybody else, we hope, and we'll be publishing those figures to the internet as well. It's going to be an interesting night, a big change from last election, which was so one-sided.
The campaign is over, the voting is complete, and Premier Mike Baird and Opposition Leader Luke Foley are now, like all of us, sideline spectators to democracy in action. So now Nick Dole looks back at the last day of campaign 2015.
A beaming Mike Baird arrives at his local polling booth, having convinced at least one voter.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was wondering if you wanted to exit poll me.
How are the nerves, Mr. Baird?
No, we feel good.
It was a family affair in the seat of Manly. Mike Baird's brother Steve and both his parents were there for support.
Obviously for a parent it's tough because you want to protect your kids from all the rough stuff that goes on.
He didn't seem to need protection on home turf, but Mike Baird thinks the result will be closer than polls predict.
There's a lot of work to do between now and 6 o'clock, so we're going to get out and do it.
Mike Baird seats one of the safest Liberal electorates in the state, but there are dozens more that could be wiped out by a swing to the Labor Party. He spent the afternoon blitzing marginal seats in the hope that some high-profile campaigning might get his candidates over the line.
No one yet?
No one yet.
Internal polling from both parties suggests the government could lose between 10 and 17 seats. The opposition had been hoping to gain the most marginal seat, East Hills, but that now looks unlikely. Candidate Cameron Murphy says someone's smearing him, falsely claiming he's a pedophile lover. He says it's gutter politics.
Labor! Labor!
Luke Foley's wife, Adele's never voted for her husband before. She hasn't been able to.
Adele's first vote. She became an Australian citizen last year.
Who did you vote for, Adele?
I voted Labor.
Mr Foley knows a win's unlikely, but says every seat gained will be a victory in itself. It's been a bruising campaign at times, but the opposition leader says he's still got some personal respect for his opponent.
Good bloke. He's my second pick for Premier today.
Voters find out which preference prevails in the coming hours. Nick Dole, ABC News.
And the ABC is live everywhere that counts, online, on your mobile, on radio and here at the ABC Election Centre. Stay with us. This is New South Wales Votes. So let's get straight into it. Anthony, what's your starting point for tonight and what seats do you think are most likely to give us an indication of the outcome?
Well, this has been a rather complex setup for an election. There's been a redistribution, there's been numerous changes of membership, 3 by-elections which have resulted in change of party representation. Our starting point, the figures we're using tonight, is that the Coalition are on 69 seats, Labor on 20, 2 Greens, they gained a seat through the redistribution notionally, and there are 2 independents. You need 47 seats for majority in the New South Wales Parliament. The government's got 69. They can afford to lose up to 21, 22 seats before they lose government. That's a swing of about 14%. Now, as far as the key seats to watch, you would expect some return from the last election. The last result was the worst Labor result since 1904. There will be a swing back. In some seats, you will see quite massive swings, but much of that swing is just the correction from last time. What we need to watch is actually some of those seats away from the marginals. Sure, if the Coalition hang on to seats on 2 or 3%, it's a great bonus for them. But really, this seat, the Elections going to be decided by, if there is a swing on, how many of those seats on 8 to 10% of the coalition hang on to. They're some of the deciders, a bit further up the pendulum than normal, but under a more normal electoral environment, they're the sorts of key seats that you have to decide the election on.
And Bridget, you've been on the campaign trail almost every day. How do you assess the leaders?
Oh, look, I think they've both had a generally good campaign. In some ways, it's actually hard to compare the two campaigns, given that Luke Foley's only been there for 12 weeks, and it's the first time that he's been running for a lower house seat and Premier at the same time. There have been no huge mistakes or gaffes or problems, and that usually augurs well for the incumbent, for Mike Baird. Mike Baird's had a strong campaign. His natural presence and popularity has certainly increased throughout the campaign, and it has to be remembered that he has taken on a hugely risky political strategy by trying to privatise the poles and wires. Labor hasn't done it. They wanted to do it and didn't do it in the past. Barry O'Farrell wouldn't do it. And so that sort of Mike Baird's popularity has helped that, and certainly I think throughout the campaign, and particularly in the last week, it's been obvious that the Liberal Party wanted people going to the polls thinking of Mike Baird and not thinking of poles and wires. Now, of course, later tonight we'll see if that gamble for Mike Baird's played off.
Well, Carmel Tebbit, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Chris.
And Gladys Berejiklian, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Can you tell us, Gladys, what did it feel like on the polling booths today?
Well, it certainly felt quite positive, but there's no doubt that what Anthony's comments said about there not being a consistent swing across the state is really accurate. In pockets of New South Wales, you find the feeling very different. So in some areas where you'd expect traditionally bigger swings, I think you'll find the swing to be quite minimal, but in other parts of the state, like the North Coast, we are anticipating larger swings. So I don't think there'll be a consistent swing across the state. It'll be very difficult to assess what seats we'll hang on to and what we won't until later in the evening when the results start coming through.
And Carmel, how do you see it?
Well, certainly the redistribution is a factor in this election that makes things quite different. We see that in the inner city where you've got a new seat of Newtown, so I think that's going to play out in an interesting way. I don't think the swing will be uniform. I think we'll see some real upsets in country New South Wales potentially, but a really interesting campaign.
Gladys, taking you to country New South Wales, and both sides have been telling us that the seat of Goulburn, which is on over 20%, might be in play tonight. Do you agree with that?
There's no doubt there's a combination of factors that is making Goulburn much more interesting. I think that will be a seat to watch this evening. I think Prugard will hang on, but there's no doubt that will be a seat to watch.
And East Hills, which is on the smallest margin in the state, should fall, you would imagine, pretty easily early on. People are saying that that might be quite a tight contest.
Yes, certainly would have been our expectation that we would pick up East Hills. It's an area where we've held that seat before, but there's been a lot of demographic change, and unfortunately a very good candidate, Cameron Murphy, I think has been treated poorly because of his role as a civil libertarian, and that's playing out in that campaign.
And what sort of things are people telling you that have turned this campaign? Is it just Mike Baird, or are there other issues that have been
There's no
in play?
doubt that Mike Baird is the most popular leader we've had in this state for decades, and that popularity will serve us well tonight. But there are also issues out there which I think have affected people's votes. We'd argue that Labor ran a very dishonest campaign in relation to polls and wires, and that will have an impact. But obviously, as has been noted, some seats like East Hills, which on paper you'd write off, we've had phenomenal candidates that have dug themselves in for 4 years and will take a lot of work to actually displace, and I think that will be interesting to see. And I think some seats on closer margins might have some surprises, and some seats further up the pendulum could actually be causing surprises as well.
This week, Carmel Tebbit, there were some questions raised about Luke Foley and raising the Chinese foreign ownership. Now, he was obviously doing that, tapping into that, amplifying the anti-privatisation sentiment by tapping into the anti-foreign ownership. How do you think that's played out?
Well, I think Luke made it very clear that his concern is any foreign ownership of our electricity network. His position is that the New South Wales government should maintain the ownership. There's no doubt that this is an issue that is unpopular in the community. It's been Labor's position that we don't support the privatisation of the poles and wires, and we are making that case very strongly.
And how do you think Luke Foley's gone throughout the campaign, given that 12 weeks ago nobody hardly knew who he was?
I think he's done exceptionally well. He's had 81 days as the leader of the Labor opposition. That is not a long time to make yourself known and also deal with the rigours and pressures of a campaign. He hasn't done it before, and yet He hasn't put a foot wrong. He's campaigned strongly, and I think he's earned the respect of even people from the other side.
And Gladys, just quickly, I think you wanted to say something on polls and wires.
Yeah, just that I thought it was really disappointing for Luke Foley to really use the race card in the last days of the campaign. I thought it was insensitive and I thought it was unnecessary, and it personally disappointed me.
But I think there was an element, though, where it did, it certainly people reacted to it, because just in the last couple of days of the campaign, when we were out with Mike Baird at the Easter show and at Flemington markets, a number of people came up to him saying, don't sell it to the Chinese, don't sell it to the Chinese. So I think this national security thing, there is a genuine sort of fear there.
No, but it is legitimate to raise issues about if the poles and wires are going to be sold, who is going to buy them? That's a legitimate question to be raised, and there are answers that you would expect the Premier to be able to provide.
I think whilst that certainly helped perpetuate fear that maybe people might feel in certain regards, I think it also had the opposite effect of making some members of the community feel uncomfortable. I thought they were insensitive remarks and shouldn't have been made by someone who aspires to be the Premier.
Well, let's see what effect they have, because later tonight the parties will celebrate or commiserate at venues across the city. Our reporters are there to keep track of the leaders' movements and capture the mood of supporters and candidates. Nick Dole is in the city with the Liberal Party, Ben Worsley is in Lidcombe with the Labor Party, and Anne Barker is monitoring the Greens at Sydney University. Nick, now you've been reporting on the campaign daily. There must be a sense of optimism in the Liberal camp?
There is, Chris, and with good reason, but that's not to say there's not a sense of nervousness out there. Of course, we all saw, and everyone here in this room has been watching what's happened in other states, and of course, first-term governments have been able to be thrown out of office. Now, Mike Baird has had an extraordinarily positive response as he's toured marginal seats today, marginals like the seat of Oatley and also East Hills. Everyone has had a positive response for him, and the exit polls are telling us that there is still a pretty good primary vote for the coalition. 46% is the figure we're being quoted by Galaxy. So some certainly good signs for the government. Having said that, that's a Sydney metropolitan figure, and that does not reflect the state. As we've heard, you can't just get a pen out in this election and draw through Liberal seats within that swing. It could be all over the place, especially places like the North Coast, where the government does look like losing the seats of Ballina and also Lismore. But certainly there is a sense of optimism here. Gradually more people will be coming through the doors. Mike Baird is spending the first part of the evening with his electorate staff and his family in the seat of Manly, and then he'll be coming in here to the city almost certainly, Chris, to declare victory.
All right, Nick, 46%. Write that down. We'll test that at the end of the night. I'm not a great believer in exit polls, but we'll see how we go. Ben, what do we know of Luke Foley's movements for this evening?
Luke Foley will watch the count with his wife and 3 children at their home in Concord West. For what it's worth, that's about 500 metres outside the boundary of the electorate that he is competing for tonight, which is Auburn. Now, his function is in the seat of Auburn at Lidcombe, here at Dooley's Catholic Club. We're expecting Luke Foley around 8:30. I suspect the timing of his arrival will be determined by how the count unfolds later this evening. It must be said he was very upbeat while voting this morning. He was asked whether a gain of 10 to 15 seats by Labor would be satisfactory. He said, I'm in it to win it. And he again made that comparison that Nick Dole just referred to the Queensland election, Labor's unlikely victory there. Must be said that the polls published recently in New South Wales suggest that that is wishful thinking by Luke Foley. I guess we'll find out soon when those results start rolling in.
Yeah, I guess one thing we can say is that Mike Baird is no Campbell Newman. And Anne, what have you been able to pick up about the Greens' ambitions for tonight?
Chris, the Greens are optimistic that they may end up ideally with 4 seats in the lower house at the end of this election, but realistic that in fact they may not win any at all. They did win a historic seat in the lower house at the last election when Jamie Parker ousted Verity Firth from the seat of Balmain. Now, even though the demographics and the new boundaries there suggest that he could be ahead slightly to win that seat again. In fact, they say that it's line ball. If there is a correction with a swing to go back to Labor, you would expect that that will benefit Verity Firth at Jamie Parker's expense. He may well lose that seat. It's the same story in Newtown, which is a new seat. Jenny Leung is up against Penny Sharp, Labor's upper house MP at the moment. There is a 4.4% margin at the moment, sort of in favour of the Greens. But again, there are boundaries that suggest that seat will in fact just go to Labor. And there are two seats in the bush, Lismore and Ballina, both of which are at the heart of the anti-coal seam gas campaign. There is a real chance that the Greens could pick up the seat of Lismore. That's the one that they're hoping for the most, where they could oust the National Party MP. Ballina is less likely. They're saying that will be line ball, but there is a chance again that they could oust the Nats MP there.
Well, Anne, I think that if you could take a pen and draw a circle around part of Sydney where you would expect the Greens to do well, it would be Newtown, so they're going to be involved in some interesting contests tonight. So Nick, Ben, Anne, thank you very much. Stay where you are and we'll be coming back to you soon. Well, we can expect the earliest votes to start coming our way. When, Anthony?
Well, they haven't started feeding any to us yet. We'll get some within the next half hour. Very small figures early. There's a fewer and fewer very tiny booths these days. So the results are coming later. It's much slower than Queensland because they have to count in the upper house. That always delays the count. We should get some reasonable figures by 7. The bulk of the votes arrive between 7 and 8.
And you do adjust some of the early figures, don't you?
We will adjust the early figures. If we've got early figures, they tend to come from the country. They tend to heavily favour the National Party traditionally because that's what the smallest booths tend to do. We correct those. We'll factor it into our analysis all evening.
OK, so while we're waiting, we'll cross upstairs to the ABC News studio for a roundup of the day's other news with Jeremy Fernandez.
Thanks, Chris. We'll return to the coverage of the New South Wales election in a moment. For now, we go from state politics to federal politics, where there's talk of a brand new tax coming within months. The banks are warning they'll pass on any costs linked to a deposit tax if it's included in the May budget. Senior government figures have told the ABC they're determined to push ahead with the levy, despite once criticising Labor for a similar policy. The opposition says it'll be another broken election promise. Here's political reporter Andrew Green.
In Victoria, a first-term coalition government was thrown out just months ago. Today, a prime ministerial plea to stop it happening federally.
We don't want people in charge of our future who are thinking small and thinking mean.
With voters in his home state going to the polls, the Prime Minister was in Melbourne, addressing the party faithful.
And yes, there will be tough decisions in this year's budget, as there must be. But there will also be good news.
And taking swipes at his opponent.
The greatest bank heist in Australian history by the Leader of the Opposition.
But the ABC understands the Abbott government's second budget will also include a tax on banking deposits. A 0.5% levy on every deposit up to $250,000 is due to start next year. The coalition attacked the idea at the last election. It's now reluctant to remove it.
Any decisions, any announcements on such a policy will be made either in the lead up to the budget or on budget night itself.
Australia's big banks are warning the costs will simply be passed on to customers.
A lot of people who are relying on their savings for their income are already seeing very low returns, and this will actually mean they get even less money.
We'll wait until we've seen a policy and when the government has actually put a serious policy on the table rather than a thought bubble, we'll respond to it.
Although a banking deposit tax only raises around $500 million a year, senior ministers are determined to keep it. The budget's Razor Gang is continuing its hunt for savings, and the ABC's learnt Barnaby Joyce's long-awaited agriculture white paper is in their sights. Sources say they're worried the document contains some crackpot and expensive ideas. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
A former girlfriend of the pilot accused of deliberately crashing a passenger plane into the French Alps has spoken about possible signs of his intentions. She's told a German newspaper that last year the pilot said that one day everyone would know his name. He also said he planned to do something that would change the whole system. Meanwhile, German prosecutors have also found more evidence the pilot had tried to conceal his health problems from his employer. Europe correspondent Barbara Miller reports.
150 people died when Germanwings Flight 9525 smashed into the French Alps. But this is the man getting the most attention. Andreas Lubitz, physically apparently fit, but speculation is mounting about the state of his mental health. German prosecutors say material found at the home of the co-pilot suggests he had ongoing health issues.
We found medical records indicating an existing illness and treatment statement. Torn-up SIG notes, including one from the day of the crash, were found. That supports the theory that the deceased hid his illness from his employer and colleagues.
A clinic in Düsseldorf has confirmed Andreas Lubitz was a patient, but has denied reports he was being treated for depression. Andreas Lubitz is thought to have locked the captain out of the cockpit and flown the Airbus A320 into the mountainside. But there are concerns those conclusions have been reached too quickly.
We think that all the information has to be gathered. We still don't have the flight data recorder, and there are many things that have to be studied prior to setting blame on someone.
European authorities are now recommending 2 crew members be present in the cockpit at all times. Screening of pilots is also likely to be intensified, but no assessment is watertight.
There's nothing to stop a pilot from barefaced lying about it and saying, oh, everything's happy and, I've got no worries at all. No, my drinking is only 2 units a week, rather than the 60 it actually is or might be.
Evidence continues to be gathered from Andreas Lubitz's family home near Frankfurt, searching for clues as to what apparently drove a young man to this murderous act in the mountains. Barbara Miller, ABC News.
The Australian captain Michael Clarke has announced he'll retire from one-day cricket after tomorrow's World Cup final against New Zealand. The 33-year-old says it's the right time to step aside and hopes the decision will prolong his Test career.
This is the last time Michael Clarke will prepare to play a one-day match for Australia.
It's about timing for me, and like I say, I think now is the right time to walk away from the one-day game.
And what a stage to bow out. Clarke has chosen the World Cup final to be his limited overs swan song.
Wonderful opportunity for every single player in that change room to walk out onto the MCG in a World Cup final. It's a very special event, but yeah, it's no more special because it's my last game.
Clarke began his one-day career more than 12 years ago. He decided to walk away shortly after Thursday's semi-final win over India. His final match will be his 245th one-day international. A score of 93 will lift him to 8,000 career runs, including 800s, 57 half-centuries and an average of almost 45.
I'm hopeful that it'll prolong my Test career as well, and that's obviously a priority for me to continue to be successful in the Test format, and I think by walking away from one-day cricket, it probably gives me my best opportunity.
His final hurdle will be a New Zealand outfit that's been in breathtaking form, led by an inspirational skipper of their own.
It's been the greatest time of our lives. It's been an amazing trip.
Brendan McCullum's Black Caps were in a relaxed mood as they completed their final training session.
What served us so well all the way through has been in a nice, relaxed, calm, emotional state, and that'll be the same tomorrow.
But for one player in particular, the emotions will be hard to contain. Gloria Cleish, ABC News.
2 factories have been destroyed in a spectacular fire in Sydney's west. Black smoke blanketed surrounding suburbs as flames 20 metres high engulfed a wrecking yard and furniture factory in Smithfield. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt.
Plumes of smoke blocked the morning sun and towering flames swept through everything in sight. Buildings melted in the intense heat.
It was a real domino effect, and it was spreading like a bushfire. It was going from one building to another.
The fire started in a wrecking yard on Woodpark Road about 8:30 this morning as workers were compacting a car.
He must have hit a petrol tank or something and went up in flames.
They tried to put a fire out themselves, but it was just getting too big.
It was out of control when crews arrived minutes later.
There were tyres, petrol in the cars, upholstery. That fuelled the fire, and it moved into a furniture warehouse packed full of timber, all sorts of upholstery.
Oh, you had all the employees, they're just running for lives, so I'm going, whoa, it's getting bad.
The black smoke from the buildings could be seen more than 50 kilometres away, but didn't pose a risk to nearby homes.
We've had to monitor that, but because of the heat of the fire, it's gone up into the upper atmosphere, so no health effects.
2 guard dogs were rescued from a burning building. A firefighter was taken to hospital with a cut hand. Another was treated for heat exhaustion. In the end, it took more than 160 firefighters to bring the blaze under control. The cause of the fire isn't yet known, but at this stage it's believed not to be suspicious. Police will investigate once the fire's put out. That could take a while. Firefighters say they'll have to stay at the scene until tomorrow. Jessica Kidd, ABC News.
You would think that 70 years after the end of World War II, we'd know all there was to know about the conflict. But as Anzac Day approaches, Australians are still finding out more about the heroic deeds of our soldiers. The Governor-General has paid tribute to a little-known group of POWs who escaped their prison camp to fight alongside Chinese guerrillas against the Japanese. Our China correspondent Stephen McDonald went to Hainan Island in the South China Sea to file this report.
There are tales in southern China of Australian soldiers fighting alongside local guerrillas during World War II, attacking the Japanese army, that they'd escaped captivity and were being hidden by Chinese villagers. There definitely were hundreds of Australian POWs brought to Hainan Island from Indonesia to work as slave labourers. A third of them would die in a prison camp from malnutrition or disease.
For the nearly 3 years they were interned here with Dutch colleagues and thousands of civilian Chinese labourers. They endured unimaginable hardship and suffering.
The Governor-General, Peter Cosgrove, joined members of the People's Liberation Army at a monument outside Lao village in honour of the Australian soldiers and the Chinese farmers who helped them.
Conditions were atrocious, and as we know, lots died. The ones who escaped, well, we're sure that they also perished.
The Governor-General came here as a sign of Australia-China friendship. And 70 years ago, the armies of our two countries resisted a foreign invasion.
The mystery, though, was what happened to prisoners who got away. At one point, a group of Australian soldiers were being forced to do road construction work when Chinese guerrillas came out from the jungle and attacked their Japanese guards. Many Australians were killed in the crossfire, but others got away with the Chinese fighters. And as the story goes, they went on to join them to launch raids against the Japanese. This memorial park has been built next to a grave site where villagers are said to have buried two of the escaped Australians. The others who got away were never found. Survivors at the prison camp were eventually rescued by American paratroopers. Stephen McDonald, ABC News, Lao Village, Hainan Island.
Italy's highest court has overturned the murder convictions against American student Amanda Knox and her then-boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito at the end of a series of high-profile murder trials. 5 judges of the Supreme Court in Rome cleared the pair of killing Ms Knox's British roommate Meredith Kercher in 2007. Amanda Knox says the ruling means she finally has her life back.
I'm incredibly grateful for what has happened, for the justice I've received, for the support that I've had from everyone.
Knox and Sollecito spent 4 years in jail for the murder, but always maintained their innocence. The mother of victim, Meredith Kercher, says she's very shocked by the acquittal. In sport, Newcastle has recorded its best start to an NRL season in 13 years after beating Penrith at Hunter Stadium this afternoon. Last night, the Bulldogs won in Golden Point and the Eels upset the Rabbitohs. Today, the Knights won by 12 to become the only undefeated team still standing in the NRL this season. Duncan Huntsdale reports.
The Knights were hard to miss in their high-vis jerseys, but the Panthers couldn't get hold of them during the opening 20 minutes. Newcastle extended its lead to 20 points after a slick backline move. Penrith mounted a fight back with 2 quick tries, but it wasn't enough to prevent the unbeaten Knights from claiming the outright competition lead after 4 wins. Kirk Gidley and the Knights celebrate. Life's been a beach for the Rabbitohs since winning the premiership, but they received a jolt from the electric Eels at Parramatta Stadium last night. Israel Folau's younger brother barged over for 2 tries.
He's going to be good for us moving forward, but he's still, got a lot of things to improve on and work on.
Chris Sando was in everything for Parramatta, scoring tries, kicking a field goal. Takes off well, and it's there! And his ongoing battle with Isaac Luke continued after the game, when the South's hooker extended an invitation to the car park.
No, I said, come look at my car, and he came and look at my car.
Another upset loomed large when West's Tigers led Canterbury 24 points to 6. The Bulldogs surged with 3 tries to take the game into extra time. A low-flying one-pointer from Moses Mbai made it 3 wins from 4 games for Des Hasler's team. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
Let's take a look at the weather now. A mostly sunny election day across the state. Ahead of a few showers and storms this week. Sydney's temperature reached 25 degrees before 3 p.m. today. Just a touch cooler in the western suburbs. Mostly clear skies prevailed in the northeast as well today. Temperatures mostly in the high 20s. Similar conditions dominated in the southeast today with no rainfall to speak of. The highest temperatures statewide were in the northern inland districts. Mungandai peaking with 31 degrees. A dry day across the capital cities, although there has been some significant rain north of Brisbane. Cloud is streaming into New South Wales from the west. That's not causing any rain this side of the border just yet. Showers near the Queensland and New South Wales coast will build in the next few days as onshore winds feed into that trough in the east. The showers may reach Brisbane tomorrow. It'll be mostly sunny in Canberra, Melbourne and Perth. Showers are expected in Hobart. Back home, it'll be partly cloudy in the morning in the northeast. There's a slight chance of a shower in the morning and afternoon. Winds on the coast locally will remain light. It'll be a mostly sunny day in the southeast after some early fog, especially inland. Winds on the water locally will also be light. Further inland, mostly sunny, grading to partly cloudy the further west we go as that cloud continues to spill in from South Australia. But it should remain dry. In Sydney, it'll be a partly cloudy Sunday, a top of 25 degrees in the city, 26 in Parramatta, 27 in Penrith and Richmond. Winds on Sydney waters will be light, turning northeasterly later. The sun will rise at 5 minutes past 7. And by Monday, the showers are expected to arrive in Sydney for a couple of days at least. We get a sunny break midweek before the wet weather returns. And that is the news for now. Let's return to the coverage of the New South Wales election with Chris Ullman.
Thanks, Jeremy. You are watching New South Wales votes coming to you from the ABC Election Centre live here in Ultimo. And we are at that stage of the evening, of course, where we are marking time just a bit while we wait for some figures to come through from the New South Wales Election Commission. And one of the things to remember this evening is that there will be a rebound from the last election. In 2011, of course, it was an historic election in New South Wales, historically bad for the Labor Party. You have to go back to 1904 to find a time when the Labor Party actually had fewer or a lower vote in the New South Wales election. I think back to 1898 to find as few seats, which was only 20. So 25.6% of the primary vote last time around. The Liberal Party, a two-party preferred vote of over 64%. So a thumping win that time around. So Carmel Tebbit, there is a fair way to come back from there.
That's right, and we'll certainly be looking at this election for a credible comeback for Labor, no question about that. I can't explain what it was like to be in a parliament where you're one of 20 people in an opposition. It was an absolute thrashing for Labor last time, and we're certainly looking for, as I said, a credible comeback from that position.
And you expect that comeback, but how far would be too far?
Well,
or one seat, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And for us, it's, you know, we're fighting for our lives to make sure we keep as many seats as possible. There's no doubt we're expecting a huge correction. Labor's vote was at its lowest in nearly a century last election. We always knew there'd be a correction, and the whole purpose of tonight will be to see how far that correction goes. There's no doubt out there on the polling booths today the base Labor vote did come back to Labor, which they'd lost at the last election. That was always going to happen. But how far that goes is obviously something we'll find out in the next couple of hours.
Well, we might be getting a sense of it now, Anthony. How's it going?
Well, we've got a swing of 8% at the moment. It's only 0.1% counted, so don't hold me to that 8% yet. But let's me run through a couple of figures. The first city is Lismore, and this is an interesting contest because it's up in the north of the state. Big arguments about coal seam gas, and as you can see there at the moment, the Greens are in second place in that contest. So that will be interesting to watch through the night. At this moment, we've got a 2% swing to the Greens. The Nationals are still ahead. A lot more counting to come in that electorate. Second seat I'll raise is Goulburn. 26 or so % margin. Prue Goward is the sitting member. Ursula Stevens is a former Labor senator, former Labor state president. Very high-profile candidate, a seat that Labor once used to poll well in, but haven't really put much effort into for quite a long time. But Ursula Stevens has run a very vigorous campaign. The seat has moved westward, has gained a lot of National Party territory, and therefore it's not natural Liberal territory, and Labor have been playing on that. And if you look at the two-party preferred swing there, now, one booth, 27%, so that's too close to call, but that is showing that just on it's Bungonia, it's a very small booth, but it shows you there's quite some variability there. Now, Rockdale, we've got two small external booths from Bexley. They're outside of the electorate, but we think we've got a reasonable handle on the swing that's occurring there. And in that electorate, 1.1% swing to Labor. That's a very close electorate. There's a lot more counting to come in that electorate as well, and they are two small externals. But first figures are starting to flow, Chris.
OK, well, looking at that seat of Goulburn, that 26% margin there, so Prue Goward would be worried at this early stage. I know was worried before this. And one of the reasons was, this is one of the campaign brochures that was put about, which was putting forward Ursula Stevens' case. It was put out by the Labor Party. It has National Party colours on it and a whole lot of endorsements from the National Party, including Wacka Williams. This was all done when she left federal parliament. She's a right-wing member. She's a very good candidate, a very good fit for this particular electorate. I noticed that Ursula Stevens, according to Wacka Williams, should have been in the Nationals. She thinks like us. She talks like us. She has such an affinity with life and the land and the hard work and dedication of country people. So a great endorsement from your side.
Well, I guess, Chris, what happens is when people say they're retiring from politics, everyone gets up and says what a great person they are, thinking that's it. And so I don't think people anticipated she'd come back and run in a seat like Goulburn. But certainly Prue has known for some weeks that she's under a bit of challenge there, and she's worked really hard to withstand that. And I'm confident she'll pull through. It's very early in terms of the numbers, so I'll still hold on before I make a prediction there.
And of course, the interesting factor in this seat is the redistribution, with that Burrinjuck part of the old electorate of Burrinjuck coming into the seat, and that's traditionally been a strong Labor area. They then went with the Nationals. Now there's no national candidate. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the booths in that part of the seat. And there's not too many areas where you would think that there were traditional Liberal-style voters. There, Mossvale, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that area, as Anthony said, has moved westward and has picked up areas which aren't traditional Liberal voters. And whenever there's a major redistribution, as has happened in that part of the world, it's always a challenge for the incumbent to get to know those constituents and try to win them over. But there's no doubt those parts of the community are challenging for us in terms of how the result might go, but I'm confident Prue will hold on.
And Bridget, sorry, go on.
No, you're right. You were talking about the last campaign, Carmel Tebbit. What can you talk about the difference? You obviously weren't out campaigning for yourself because you're retiring and Marrickville is no longer, the seat of Marrickville is gone. But what was the sort of difference like on the campaign trail? Did you feel this campaign compared to last in terms of people coming up to you and talking about Labor, because there was such hate for Labor in 2011?
Yeah, very, very different feel, no question about that. I mean, I worked a lot in Newtown, a lot in Summerhill, plus in other seats across the state, and the anger's gone. The anger's gone. You certainly feel that. Even people who weren't voting Labor this time didn't have that same sense of really white-hot anger with us. So a very different feel. Let's hope that translates into votes.
Well, let's find out whether or not that is translating into votes. Anthony?
Well, we've got another quick seat run here. The seat of Tamworth has a lot of interest because Peter Draper, the second-place candidate there, he's the former independent member for the seat. He's challenging Kevin Anderson from the National Party. The Labor Party's running a distant third there. These are smaller rural booths. You'd expect that from the first figures, but it is a contest between the Nationals and Peter Draper. And just to look at the very first swing there, we're looking at a 20% swing to the National Party. That's come from some booths. I just realised that's come from some booths in the old Northern Tablelands area of the electorate. So that's not a reliable swing there, but they're the first figures from Tamworth. Paul Toole is the National Party MP for Bathurst. He's won with a 36% swing to him at the last election. It was a massive swing, but this is an electorate which we'll be watching for the booth-by-booth figures, because it's an 8% swing to Labor. We'll be watching how it turns out later in the evening. This electorate includes Lithgow, which has got a big coal mining and electricity industry. I'd expect there may be a considerable swing back to Labor in that part of the electorate. At this moment, it's only 8% swing, which wouldn't damage the National Party's hold on the seat. And the safe National Party seat of Orange, Andrew Gee won it for the first time at the last election, and he's well ahead ahead on those figures, and there's a swing, no particular swing in that electorate at the moment. We're seeing a big swing in the country, but as I said, at the moment they're very preliminary figures, and we'll continue to dive through the entrails for a while.
I love this time of the night. It's always fascinating to try and work out what that all means. In fact, it means not very much at all to any of us at this stage. We'll need a fair bit more of the vote counted by then. We can just go back and talk us through some of the issues of the campaign. Obviously, polls and wires was the big one for you, and that was a very risky decision to take.
It was a very risky decision, but a very gutsy and courageous one, because we very strongly believe it's the right thing to do. And predictably, we believe Labor ran a dishonest campaign in relation to that issue. We're arguing that with the return on the rent from the long-term lease, that we'll be able to invest in roads and rail and hospitals and schools. So we're saying to the community, would you rather hang on to the rent from a pole and a wire, or would you rather have rail, roads, schools and infrastructure? And that's certainly been our position.
And all that's understood, but it's a pre-existing disposition that would appear in Australian electorates that they don't like the sale of electricity assets.
Well, let's see how the night goes, Chris, in relation to that, because the electorate will be voting precisely, I think, in a lot of key areas on that precise point. We're looking tonight for a mandate. If we're returned with seats, if we're a majority government, we believe we'll receive that mandate, and we believe it's in the best interest of our state, and we did it because we think it's the right thing to do.
And Carmel Tibbett, if the Liberals win tonight, Luke Foley has said that he is going to stand against privatisation whether or not whether the government gets returned. Don't you think if they win with a reasonable majority, there has been a mandate then for this?
No, I mean, we've made it very clear all the way through the campaign what our position is on this issue and what we would do if the coalition are re-elected. And I think our voters would expect us to honour the promise that we took to the election, and that is that we're opposed to privatisation of the poles and wires. I certainly think it was a significant issue in the campaign, no question about that, but in some ways, because so much of the coverage and debate focused on that, there were some other issues that slipped under the radar a little bit, which I also think were pretty important in some of the seats, particularly in regional New South Wales.
The thing with poles and wires, the polling has shown that more than half of coalition voters didn't like poles and wires, but they like Mike Baird. Do you think anyone else would have been, if he does get through, do you think anyone else would have been able to get it through? Because it seems like that the Liberal Party were focusing on Mike Baird rather than the poles and wires.
There's no doubt that Mike Baird's the only leader that will see that through, and I believe, contrary to what the Labor Party is saying, that if we are successful this evening, if we end up with more seats in the Parliament than any other party for a majority government, we will have that mandate. And we've fought hard on that campaign, and arguably it'll cost us some seats. So we believe very strongly we were honest, we were upfront, and on that basis we deserve to have that support moving forward.
All right, well, we're pushing up to 3/4 of an hour since the polls closed, and hopefully that means that there might be a few more results, Anthony.
Yes, and we've got something from that seat. There's a lot of interest up north in Ballina. Now, this is two very small boos, so these aren't a lot of votes, but you can see at the moment the Greens are second in that electorate. It must be said this is an electorate with two quite distinct ends. You've got Byronshire, which has got a lot of alternative lifestyle and a high Green vote, and Ballina, which is much more traditional and got a high national vote. So this is from inland. This is from sort of more the alternative lifestyle areas. If you look at the swing that's occurring on those two boos, it's a 34% swing, and the Greens are well ahead, but it's certainly not decided at this stage. That will be an electorate we'll be coming back to regularly during the evening. Cootamundra, this is a seat where the vote comes in very early because it's a western seat. Huge electorate. Katrina Hodgkinson's a member for Burrinjuck. She's had to move west with her seat abolished and absorbed largely into Goulburn. But on these numbers, she will romp in very easily. It's a very safe National Party seat. We will see a lot of big double-digit swings like that to Labor in country areas at this election. The Labor vote just disappeared at the last election outside of the central part of the states. In the country areas, there was one electorate at the last election when Labor didn't even get its deposit back, and there were under 10 in a lot of seats. So we will see a lot of that tonight, even though it may not produce a lot of seat changes. And finally, just one seat. I was interested in this. I have no idea whether this will continue on later in the evening, but Paul Fennell, who runs a DLP candidate, he has been the national president of the DLP. He's contesting the seat as an independent. This is a very tiny count, so it could actually be his friends and neighbours voting. I don't know where the polling place is from. But that's just, we're watching some of these seats in the country to see if surprises like that pop up.
We're seeing, Anthony, more of these situations where the big threat to the coalition outside the city is independents, well-known independents?
Look, it has been that way. I mean, in the last term of the Labor government, they did actually get in quite a habit of encouraging independents to run. And independents were, once they were in Parliament, they actually got quite good service from MPs and from the government, and that helped them get re-elected. And the more independents there were in the country, the less National Party members there were, and the harder it was for the government, the coalition, to get back into office. So that has happened, and certainly in country areas, there's a great tendency to want an independent who'll just concentrate on local services.
Well, certainly one of the issues that has had a visceral reaction in parts of the country has been coal seam gas development, and that has tended to unite traditional National Party voters with Greens and Labor voters. Kamal Tibbet, how big an issue do you believe that's been in some of the electorates that we'll see this evening?
Oh, it's been a huge issue, no question. Far North Coast, in those seats, it's been a very big factor. Tamworth, it's a factor. There's a lot of concern in the community about coal seam gas and the feeling that it's pushing ahead too quickly without the necessary protections in place.
Interestingly, I get a head nod from you too, Gladys Berejiklian, and you obviously believe the same thing as the Labor Party, that there's a concern in the political class about coal seam gas.
There's no doubt I agree on that point, but I also want to make the point that we came to government, about half the state had coal seam gas licences issued over them, which the Labor Party put in place. We've actually reduced that down to about 13%. So that's an issue, a mess we've actually had to clean up in the last 4 years. So I found Labor's position to be extremely hypocritical on that one.
Look, I know you can't mention this issue and say anything in favour of coal seam gas that doesn't end in a deluge of complaints to the ABC, I know from bitter experience. But your own chief scientist has said, not everywhere and not in all circumstances, but in some parts of this state, coal seam gas could go ahead, it would not cause damage and it would not go into prime agricultural land. Yet nobody, it seems, in politics is prepared to make an argument for that kind of gas development.
Well, I think we've said that there should be a moratorium until we're confident that all of the recommendations that the Chief Scientist has made are being implemented. So we certainly haven't said that coal seam gas can never go ahead in any part of the state, but we want to make sure that those requirements set down by the Chief Scientist are actually implemented.
We would argue they should have done that when they were in government and not issue all those licences, because that's really what's caused the community angst. The community is saying to us, show us the evidence, where is the science? And we think this is a concern and we agree with them. But we came to this state in the last 4 years not having issued a single licence. We inherited all of them from the Labor Party. And so, the fact that they're now campaigning again on this issue is extremely hypocritical. They created the mess. They caused the angst because they didn't do their homework in the first place.
But it does seem like in the electorates that the people and the voters in the electorates aren't hearing that message, because it seems like they are supporting Labor and the Greens, and I think they probably feel, is there a sense that they feel, well, the government did renew some of those licences and that you've been now in for 4 years, and have they put the coal seam gas argument back on the government rather than blaming Labor?
Yeah, I think there is a lack of appreciation as to where the problem started in the first place. And if we argue that if the Labor Party had done their homework in government and actually not been so generous in the first place, that we wouldn't have all this community angst. Because at the end of the day, notwithstanding what the science might say, you also do need to listen to the community, make sure you bring the community with you. And certainly, I think we agree that it's a big issue out there, especially in regional New South Wales.
It's 6:47. We are we're more than 3/4 of the way through the first hour of the count, and hopefully, Anthony, things are beginning to emerge that we can talk about.
Well, there are things to talk about. Whether it's a clear picture of the result yet is another matter entirely. Just to explain, there was a major redistribution before this election, which means it scrambles the polling places a bit. But the Electoral Commission was also very keen to ensure as many absent votes were counted as possible. So they created something like 300 to 400 new polling places, which are external, so that if you live in Newtown and you go and vote at Leichhardt Town Hall, that's also a polling place for Newtown, even though it's not in the district. And there's been many hundreds of those. And it just so happens a lot of them are returning early in the night, and it's creating a little uncertainty over exactly what the picture is. But having said that, let me look at some of the figures we've got. Wyong is one of those electorates where we're getting those figures. Of course, this is where Darren Webber, the Liberal MP, had to stand aside because of the ICAC investigation. New Liberal candidate Sandra Kerr's defending it. David Harris is the former Labor member for the seat. And at the moment, when we look at the two-party preferred swing there, it's 17%. That's a huge swing. I wouldn't be prepared to give it away at this stage because these are small external booths, and that actually sort of interferes with some of our early predictions. But we are seeing swings on. It's just the question of whether it's the right areas or not. Brian Doyle at the last election, 46% to 44.7%. he's ahead on first preferences. We're factoring in a two-party preferred of 16%, but again, all three of the booths we've got are outside of the districts. We've had to try and estimate what the numbers are. I'm not sure if they're reliable. I'm not sure if I've got good numbers or not. But at the moment, we are seeing a swing. I wouldn't sort of call a seat on a margin like that. And Gosford has got exactly the same situation occurred. All the figures that are in are coming from outside of the district. They're not within the district. They're not a polling place which have been used before. Again, we're seeing substantial swing, 14%. I wouldn't rely on that at this stage. But we are seeing a swing. We knew we were going to see a swing, but we're not getting quite enough figures from the right places to actually call any electorate yet.
And Andy, can you take us through the pre-polls and postals? Because I've had complaints both from Labor and Liberal parties that they are concerned about the way that pre-polls and postals are being handled, but you don't see it as a particular problem this evening, or 25% of the vote might not be counted this evening, or we won't know about that vote.
Well, it's true. I mean, look, the Commission could count those votes tonight, possibly. But I'm not sure the parties would have scrutineers to observe it. So, I mean, they complain about they're not counted, but they also have to provide scrutineers to ensure it's watched. The Commission prefers to have scrutineers available. They will count the I votes later tonight, which is done electronically. They are, I understand, counting the postals and the pre-polls overnight. But I do stress to people, the Commission on a polling day has its best people running polling places. They're in the polling places and the counting votes there. If they count the pre-polls and the postals from 6 o'clock, they have to have good staff running there as well and doing that. The future of pre-poll and postal votes is electronic voting, pre-poll electronic voting. Then all those votes, you're talking about 10, 15, 20% of the vote, would be counted very quickly.
Is there anywhere outside the ACT that does that?
Not yet. I mean, there's a lot of concern. There's been concerns about the I vote here. But that is the way it'll come, because in some of these polls, I just looked at the numbers here in, I think it's a Dubbo, 15,000 pre-polls. Even if the Commission tried to count them tonight in the Divisional Returning Officer, the average polling place rarely gets bigger than 3,000. You've got 15,000 there. They'd be lucky to count that before midnight anyway. So that's why it's rather difficult. Given the numbers of pre-polls that we're getting these days, it's very difficult for the Commission to count them anyway.
But you think that it would only be a problem if it gets close tonight?
It's only a problem if it gets close, and that many of them will be there tomorrow. I always stress to people, it's important the Commission get it right above all else, and not that it be done in a hurry and mistakes be made. And one of the important parts of the electoral process is scrutineering, and the scrutineers there are observing the count is done correctly. So if they're going to count the votes, there have got to be scrutineers available as well.
So, Gladys, if we get down to pre-polls and postals, you'll be a bit nervous this evening.
Oh, absolutely. But it's interesting to see, we've seen record numbers of people vote before the day, whether it's I vote, whether it's pre-poll, whether it's postals, and that will have an impact on the process in years to come. And I feel there's a higher and higher percentage of people voting before the day, and that does sometimes impact the result, because at a certain point in time, if you vote, there might be a certain message, or a particular side of politics might be peaking at that time, and that can affect the vote, because things go up and down over a 2-week period, and people have been essentially voting for 2 weeks. And I'd argue the Labor Party peaked before we did. I believe we peaked later in the campaign, and I think that will affect how the votes come in as well.
Well, we all hope to peak late. What I'm hoping I'm doing at the moment. Carmel, the parties put a lot of effort, don't they, into pre-poll voting now? It's weeks of effort, in fact, for parties.
Yes, that's right. And what we saw with this election was more pre-poll venues opened as well. So you had electorates that had 2 and 3 places where you could do pre-poll voting, which hasn't been the case in city seats in the past. So there's certainly a lot more opportunity for people to pre-poll vote. And I agree with what Gladys said. I think we will see in future elections parties taking that into account and making their big announcements perhaps earlier in the campaign to try and take advantage of that.
In the last campaign, in 2011, I think there was around 330,000 that pre-polled, and this campaign they're expecting up to 900,000. And one thing, as you're mentioning, it will make the campaign trail much longer. Labor, the campaign launch was 4 weeks ago. The Liberal Party was a week ago. Do you think, you mentioned, do you think, Carmel Tebbit, that the Labor campaign might have peaked too early to try and get those pre-poll votes?
No, look, we had a very particular desire for a new leader to be out there with the campaign launch and have that opportunity for the community to get to know Luke as early as possible. So that was the rationale behind our early campaign launch. I think it worked. I think also announcing our infrastructure plan early was important in our campaign, because up until we announced that, there were a lot of questions about, well, Labor's not selling poles and wires, how are they going to pay for their promises? And we found that dissipated once the infrastructure plan was announced, and we were able to outline what it was we'd do and how we'd pay for it.
Gladys, how much has campaigning changed with the arrival of social media?
Oh, incredibly different. I remember back in the dark ages 12 years ago when I was first elected, email didn't play a big role. But as a local member now, the most frequent type of correspondence you get is email. But now social media means not everybody's watching, with all due respect, the nightly news or reading the papers. They're getting their information from a whole range of sources, and that is having a huge impact on the political process. It means messages can't be as targeted as we'd like because people are getting them from a whole different source of places. And I was really buoyed by the campaign we led on social media for the first time. We really dealt with it with gusto, and the Labor Party similarly, I think, paid a lot of attention to social media. But there's no doubt that all parties are going to have to deal with this even in a bigger way. The I vote phenomena, for example, you can't place a how to vote in someone's hand or post them anything if they're going online and voting.
Well, a little voice in my head tells me our hashtag tonight is New South Wales Votes, if you want to get on board that one. Tremendous.
Did you see the mean tweets?
The mean tweets?
Mike Baird put out the mean tweets, and it was sort of, one of those things that
it was pretty cool. I have to say it's pretty cool. Obviously after Mike did it, I went back and saw what people did overseas, but it's a good way of actually communicating with an audience.
The audience is shattering over lots of different venues now. It's hard for political parties to vie for people's attention.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And another factor is, of course, mobile phones. So in years gone by, we've always relied on being able to phone people on landlines. Now, that is much more difficult with so many people that don't have landlines, particularly younger people. And we see that in the polls where often the younger vote is not accurately reflected because they're not polling people with mobiles.
Well, it is 5 to 7, and we'll go back to Anthony Green now at his touchscreen to see if we have some more numbers in. Anthony.
Well, we do. Blue Mountains, neck and neck there. There's one tiny booth at Bilpin, which is well outside of the electorate, which you've got a preference come from, but I think it's completely unreliable. And Morven, I think it's called Morven Gardens or something. Neck and neck there. I can't really tell you who would win on those figures, but that's a seat we'll come back to, and it will depend on what happens with the Green preferences in that electorate. Londonderry, we've got one polling place from Banks Public, which is outside of the electorate, and on those numbers it's showing a 25% swing. Again, it's another one of those from outside of the electorate, so we'll just discount that a little bit. And in Prospect, this is a seat which is really tough for the Liberal Party to hold. Andrew Rohan won it in the last election. Hugh McDermott is the Labor candidate there in that seat. Used to be known as Smithfield, it's now called Prospect. But again, we're seeing a swing of 9% in that electorate. That's from a more meaningful set of booths, but it's a very marginal seat. So at the moment, that's the best seat we're seeing change. The nearest we're getting to a seat which looks like it's changing hands, and it's one that's expected to change hands.
It shouldn't it? Prospect, Swansea, Macquarie Fields, Rockdale, they're the sorts of places you would imagine would be returned, Anthony, wouldn't you, to the Labor Party?
They are. I mean, look, anything under about 5% are in the gun. I mean, you are talking about the Labor Party. The Liberal Party got 64.2% two-party preferred. That's the most one-sided result since the Second World War. The swing was over 16%, the biggest swing in Australian political history. That was what a scale of the result was. So there are seats on 10%, which really would be marginal seats at most normal elections. The last time they ended up quite safe for the Liberal Party. So
and yet we might see a seat like East Hills, which is on a margin of 0.2, which stays with the coalition.
Well, I always like to see the result before I speculate on what might happen. So.
I'm sorry to drag you into that so early on.
I'm not a commentator.
Oh.
Anthony, I think it was this time at about 7 o'clock in 2011 when Anthony actually called it, almost, I think.
It wasn't hard to call the last election.
No, but I think it was at about 7 o'clock that you did call it.
Yeah, but that's like scrolling forward to the end of the movie and then having to go back and do the whole thing again.
Yeah, if only it were that easy tonight, Richard.
No, it certainly won't be. But East Hills, let's return to that seat. Cameron Murphy is very well known because he's had a public profile, obviously, in the position that he's had now for a very long time, speaking out about all manner of human rights. And you're saying he's been targeted by people because of that past?
Well, yes, certainly that's what we've seen. We've seen stickers being put on his posters. We've seen leaflets being distributed about him. Now, none of this material is attributed, so we don't know where it's coming from, but a dirty campaign and unfortunate to see. You'd like to think that campaigning would rise above that.
East Hills, do you think you might hang on to that?
Oh, Glenn Brooks has done a phenomenal job. On any day, you would write that seat off right at the beginning of the night. It's on the tiniest of margins, and you'd expect the Labor Party correction would see that sweep as part of a Labor gain. But we're not willing to write it off. We think, Glenn Brooks is in there with a great chance. He's actually dug in really well, worked really hard for 4 years. And literally, if he sees something wrong in his electorate, he'll roll up his sleeves and go and fix it himself. He's that kind of guy. And I think the local community really relates to that. And he is one of them. Someone who started off with humble beginnings and became a very successful small business person. Really the story about the Liberal Party in Australia, if you think about it in those terms. And I think he resonates well with this community.
How important is it to pick the right candidates for electorates?
It's critical. It's critical. And we have seen a lot of demographic change in East Hills, so there are other factors at play there. But Cameron Murphy was a very good candidate. He's someone who has got a great Labor pedigree, worked extremely hard, a very articulate person who I think has been affected by this campaign of dirty tricks that's been run against him.
Is it just that? No, I'm not denying that's the campaign. He does not live in the electorate, though, does he?
Too early to say whether it's just that. I mean, of course, there are other issues at play as well, but I think it's a factor.
Yeah, we would argue we have a candidate who resonates with the local community in that seat, which is why he's putting up such a strong fight. And I think in these contests it's so important in those key seats to have people that are one of the community.
OK, well, we're moving on in the counts and starting to get some more numbers flowing through, Anthony.
Yes, and that's go to one of those key seats everyone's interested in, Penrith. This was the seat where we saw that extraordinary 25% swing in 2010, which led to was a precursor of what was to follow the following March. Stuart Ayres was the winner on that occasion. He replicated the results of the last election. The new Labor candidate is MSR. The issue here is Jackie Kelly, who's on 8.4%, former federal member for the seat. She's opposed to Badgerys Creek. I think she ran for pre-selection for Penrith for the Liberal Party, but she's running and she's issued a hard vote card directing preferences to Labor. At this stage, Stuart Ayres ahead. We don't have the right polling places to be making an accurate swing, but that's a seat we'll be coming back to. We've got one polling place which is showing a big swing, but it's one of those external booths, so I'll have to wait. Lismore I thought we'd come back to because the county's now progressing further and the Greens are still in second place. At this stage, Thomas George is on 39.6, the Greens 31.6, ALP 24.2. The question in a seat like Lismore is what the big towns come in. When Lismore comes in, it also includes Tenterfield up in the Northern Tablelands now, so it's a substantially changed. If you look at the two-party preferred swing that's there, there is a 23% swing. The Commission is counting between the Nationals and the Labor Party tonight, and that's the preference count we're getting tonight. So this will be not reliable if the Greens finish second. I think it's a reasonable estimate, but that's a sign of one of those seats. And I thought I'd bring up Goulburn again because we had some bad first figures for Prue Goward, and I thought we should bring up some later figures. That's what the numbers are at the moment, 51 to 31 for the Labor Party. We actually have a two-party preferred swing in a number of booths now. It's showing a big swing, but Prue Goward is still ahead at this stage for the Liberal Party. So there are some big swings going on. At this stage, it's not turning into seats that we can be really certain about. Chris.
And Anthony, you were saying that swing in Penrith in 2010 was a precursor of what happened in the following year for the New South Wales Labor Party, but it was also heralded the end of Kevin Rudd. That was one of the effects that it had. Yes, I particularly remember on the day the Australian running a story sort of saying the result could indicate the end of Kevin Rudd, which I thought was a bit odd at the time, but it turned out to be spot on. It did turn out to be. So there were things running at the time. I think for Barry O'Farrell, who spent every morning outside Penrith Railway Station in an election campaign, to actually have all that sort of glory grabbed away at the end, I think was a bit depressing for him. So. It was even more depressing for Kevin Rudd. But, of course, we can see these sorts of effects of elections. It was just after the Queensland election result where we saw essentially a move against Tony Abbott in his own party room. There was a spill motion then. Carmel Tibbett, how big a factor do you believe that Tony Abbott was in this election campaign? What were people telling you on the booths? No doubt an issue. Tony Abbott is very unpopular in the community, and people certainly were communicating that. But I think you need to be careful not to overplay what a factor it is, but it's significant. If it wasn't significant, I think we would have seen him playing a stronger role in the Coalition's campaign, and we certainly didn't see that. And if it wasn't significant, you wouldn't spend advertising dollars on it? Absolutely.
Well, I think Labor very much tried to make it that, but it wasn't an issue at all. We ran a very strong campaign based on state issues. We've been in government 4 years. We had a strong record of what we've done in government, and of course our forward agenda, our vision for New South Wales is what we ran on, and we're confident that tonight that's what people are casting their votes over. Do they want Mike Baird as Premier tomorrow morning, or do they want to see Luke Foley Premier?
But you have to say it is unusual to see a launch of a campaign, and we've seen quite a few of them now with Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, where the Prime Minister doesn't end up saying anything or is not there.
And also didn't talk to the media, ushered in and
the
ushered
Prime
out.
Minister was a very welcome guest at our launch. He sat in the front row, I shook his hand, and we were very happy to have him there, as was Mike, and the Premier specifically acknowledged the Prime Minister. We're grateful that he was there, and we're happy to have the support of all our colleagues.
It was a Marcel appearance, though.
Well, look, we're happy to have the support of all our colleagues, and you'd think on that occasion that the state MPs, the ones that want the vote of the community and the trust of the community, are the ones putting themselves on the front foot.
OK, well, we've been looking at different bits of the state so far, but we might go to Anthony now to see if we can get a bit of a picture of what it's looking like around the entire state.
Yeah, well, let's do the state figures for the first time. The primary vote, we've got 1.6% counted. The Liberals are on 37, Nationals on 7, Labor 35, the Greens 11.5 and others 9. 44.3 for the coalition, which is roughly what the poll has been saying to 35, but these figures are slightly tilted towards the country at the moment, so that they will change through. And if you just look at the change in vote that's occurring at the moment, 1.8 against Liberals, 4 against the Nats, and that's a statewide figure. 9.7 to the Labor Party. Now I'll bring up the regional. Actually, I'll do the regional trends. What you're seeing is a big drop in the National Party vote at the moment, 10.6%. So that's occurring across the country. Should I do the chamber?
Stage.
Well, no. Look, I didn't actually mean to do that, so I'll change and go. It's the first entry in the drinking game.
There you go. Hashtag.
The seat of Coogee, Bruce Notley-Smith. Coogee was a seat that anybody who knows land prices in Sydney would wonder why it was still in Labor hands for well over a decade before it finally fell at the last election. Bruce Notley-Smith is ahead on 41.9. Paul Pearce, 35%. He's the former Labor member for the seat from 2003 to 2011. And the Greens are on 20% there. The swing figure we're seeing there is 4.7. This is one of those seats on about 8 that the Labor Party needs to hold. The Liberal Party needs to hold. And the other thing to say is there was an opinion poll in the campaign which had the Liberals on about 52. So that figure is sort of matching what we'd expect to see. So that's an encouraging first figure for Bruce Notley-Smith. Less encouraging for the Liberal Party is Mulgoa. And I don't have access on the screen to where these figures are from. The first figures are good for the Liberal Party. And if I turn to my computer screen, I can figure out where the numbers are actually coming from in Mulgoa. No, it's going to bring up Lake Macquarie for me somewhere. But anyway, that's the first figure, and I think we've got a two-party preferred swing, 19%. That's one of these strange external booths. I was afraid of bringing it up until I looked at it, but there you go. And Summerhill, 0.4% count. Oh, it's a very small figure. I thought there might be something more meaningful there. This is the new seat that's replaced Marrickville. This is actually one of the booths from Newtown, so it's outside of the Summerhill electorate in Green Central, so it's not surprising. So this is a very early figure, and I don't think we can rely on that.
I should say that the ABC encourages the responsible use of alcohol, but there are apparently drinking games based on the things that you say, Anthony.
Yes, it's terribly embarrassing.
What are those drinking games?
What are they?
If I make an error, if the computer plays up, there was also a bet whether, we'll see how it goes tonight.
Okay, as long as it's not based on what we say, it's right.
If you are enjoying that, then enjoy it with a ginger beer, is what we would say. But interesting early figures, 1.6% of the vote counted. Again, still a little hard to say where we're going on there. I think I'd be a bit concerned if I was in the National Party, though.
Chris, they're very early figures, but I want to put things in perspective. Labor will need to increase its primary vote by at least 13% to have its second worst election victory. So they're starting off a very low base. So even if they increase their primary vote by 13%, it will still be their second worst result in New South Wales. So they've got a lot of ground to cover or to make up, and we are assuming that correction will be quite substantial this evening. But again, the extent of it will play out in the next hour or so when we get the results from some of the bigger booths in some of these key areas.
Certainly, Carmel, but you want it to be above 10%, at least to beyond just sort of a normal correction, to see something from the campaign.
It's very early days yet, so I think it's certainly too early to get a sense of what's really happening. We expect a credible result. I think when we saw what happened in Queensland, people got very carried away. But New South Wales and Queensland, very different situations. So we would be happy with a result that put us, in the 30s in terms of number of seats.
Certainly you'd have to say lessons learned out of Queensland. It does boil down a lot to the personality of these two premiers, that there was a visceral reaction against Campbell Newman. One of the things that will be interesting as the night goes on was the preference flows in Queensland were 20% higher towards the Labor Party than anything we'd seen before, and optional preferential, same sort of voting system here, but you wouldn't be expecting that, of course.
No, and fortunately for us in New South Wales, there's light and day between how Mike Baird is received by the community and how Campbell Newman was perceived by the community. But I think the preference flow will be really interesting to watch today, because 4 years ago, Labor and Greens weren't exchanging preferences. They are tonight. And what I'll be interested to see is how much of the vote is being exhausted. That is, how many people are putting just vote one and how many are actually following the Labor and Green how to vote and exchanging preferences.
And Gladys, what's your feeling or what's the feedback on what's going to happen in the upper house? Because lots of the voters, as we mentioned, like Mike Baird but don't like Polls and Wise. Do you think they'll split?
Well, we're hoping our primary vote will hold up and give us that extra seat in the upper house, because that will make the difference. But again, there are so many extra minor parties running, and a lot of them had a very strong presence on the polling booths today. So a lot of single issue parties were out there trying to woo voters with their upper house support. So that will have an impact, I think.
Carmel, what do you think? Do you think there's going to be...
Yeah, certainly going to have to watch those minor parties in the upper house. I mean, the No Land Tax Party is in a good position because of their placement on the ballot paper. They had people handing out at every booth that I was at, and my understanding is they were being paid.
$300 I heard on the radio.
That's right, and I think also being induced to hand out by material that appeared to be coming from the Electoral Commission was what one of their workers told me, so a bit of confusion there. So those minor party votes are going to be very critical in the upper house.
Okay, so we will be watching some bellwether seats tonight, and the seat of Monero, whenever you do a federal election, it's the seat of Eden Monero, which is always said to be going with the government at elections. It mostly does. The seat of Monero is very similar. I think 25 out of 28 times since the seat was created, it has gone with government. And so how are things going there, Anthony?
Well, look, you can't resist doing Monero. It's just one of those seats. It's for a seat which has, and the same with Eden Monero, for seats which are such bellwether constituencies. The funny thing is, they're actually completely unlike every other electorate. A quarter of the electorate works for the public service. There's no other electorate within Cooey of that. Yeah. John Barilaro, the National, won it the last time. Steve Wan, the former member, is currently an MLC. He's contesting the seat. And we've got 3 polling places where we've got actual preference counts. There's none of these annoying external booths in this electorate. So on the booths we've got so far, there's actually a swing to the National Party. Now, of course, this will be decided by Queanbeyan, which is the dominant part of the electorate, but the first small figures are very encouraging for the National Party. Now, the next thing, I just want to do this quickly because we're so cautious about swings sometimes, and big swings, you get distracted. At the moment, if I look at the seats we're definitely giving away to one side or the other, I've got the coalition up to 48. At the stage, we're seeing with just 2.5% of the vote counted, we've got the National Party, the coalition winning the election. We've got them to 45 already. Now, I'm prepared to wait a little bit longer, but I think that's very indicative. Usually the model's quite accurate. It's very indicative that we could be seeing the government returned even at this early stage, but I'm always cautious. The computer model works like that. I'm always prepared to wait while it's still only 7:10.
And without the dramatic swing that you might be expecting if that was the case?
Well, there is a swing of 10%. That's what makes you see a lot of seats falling, but you're forgetting the government is starting with a huge majority. And already I'm just looking down my list. There are seats like Monero, like Tamworth, like Coogee, which aren't falling at this stage.
But you're saying too, Queanbeyan, of course, that most of a large chunk of Queanbeyan works in Canberra, drives down Canberra Avenue every morning and back again in the evening. Do you expect that they would be largely Labor voters?
Yeah, and I've always said this election will be decided on the seats on 8 to 10%, which is Coogee, Kiama, Seven Hills, Holsworthy, and they're not falling at this stage. None of them are sort of are falling to the Labor Party at the moment. They're not showing up, so I'd be expecting to see some of them popping up on this side. So at the moment, it looks like the coalition has been returned.
Okay, so Carmel Tibbett, are you hearing anything from anyone from your team around the country that's giving you any information around the state, I should say, that's giving you any information?
Yeah, we're getting some early results. I'm being told that in Ballina there's an 18% swing against the Nationals, but these are very early results, so we need to be a bit careful about that. We're also being told that we're doing well in the Blue Mountains. We've got a great candidate there, Trish Doyle. Again, a swing to us, and this is in a booth that normally is a Liberal booth. We're seeing in Port Stephens. I think that'll be a very interesting one to watch, because in Port Stephens I'm being told that our vote is up 17%. Now, again, early days, but we have a great candidate there.
Just to put that in perspective too, 14.7%, which is a swing that you actually needed to take government, you would have won 23. That's right on the point of the pendulum where you would have changed government. That's 14.7%, and you're saying at the moment you're on 17?
Sorry, this is in Port Stephens. I don't think we're going to see uniform swings across the state. I think we're going to see some quite wide variations. But certainly in some of those seats where we were hopeful of doing well, the early results seem to be confirming that.
Gladys?
Yeah, some of the seats we hold on very small margins, although it's early days, are holding up well. Places like Oatley, apparently we're doing very well. In Western Sydney, we're holding up. In the Central Coast, there's a few interesting results coming through. It is early days, but we're quietly pleased with some of the results we're seeing, but again, very early days. And I think there will be a few surprises. It's the middle bit of the pendulum we'll be looking at, not really the far end, ironically.
So can you give us a surprise at this stage? Where would you be looking?
No, not yet. I'll wait a bit longer before I make any of those predictions.
Is there a Central Coast surprise there on your phone?
Well, look, I thought entrance would be really tough for us, but apparently it's early days, but we're looking like we've got a chance in the entrance, whereas I would have assumed that would be a seat that Labor would gain tonight. So it'll be an interesting contest in a few places.
Carmel, what about the western suburbs of Sydney? It used to be the Labor Party's heartland. Of course, the demographics, as you say, have changed a lot there. Once upon a time, it was heavily unionised workforce out that point. Essentially, the blue-collar workers of Sydney lived out that way, but there have been lots of changes in those areas.
Yes, that's very true, and we have struggled in parts of Western Sydney for quite some time now, but there's no doubt that 2011 saw our vote absolutely decimated. To lose seats like Granville, Prospect, I mean, that was very disheartening for Labor voters. We would be hopeful that some of those seats come back to us. I think we'll do well in Londonderry, very good candidate there. Prospect, I would hope that we'd do well in, but we won't see it all come back, not this time.
OK, well, we'll go back to Anthony Green again for some more early results. Anthony.
A seat I'm interested in, and we may not know the result tonight, is the electorate of Wollongong on the south coast. Noreen Hay is being challenged by Arthur Rorris, who's currently finished. He's the former head of the South Coast Labor Council, former member of the Labor Party, resigned from the party to run as an independent. He's in third place at the moment, but the Greens have got 13 and the Liberals got 21. I can't remember the Green had a vote card. I think it was to Rorris. I'll have to double check that. But what you're seeing there is that could yet cascade and put Rorris ahead of the Liberal Party, and there's a lot more votes to count as well. The Commission tonight is counting between the Labor and the Liberal Party candidates. If Rorris gets into second place at any stage in the count, I don't know the result, but that's not a very high Labor first preference vote at this stage, so that's a seat we'll be coming back to later in the evening. And we've got first figures from East Hills. They've got Cameron Murphy slightly ahead on first preferences, but the polling place that's from is basically there's no swing in that polling place. So we haven't got anything meaningful yet for East Hills, except for these two Bass Hills polling places, which are outside of the electorate, are showing no swing on what I estimated was the result last time. So nothing reliable yet on East Hills.
OK, Anthony, just for the people watching at home, for this strap that we can see just down here, can you explain that to people? What are they seeing there and what's that telling them?
We are putting down the bottom there the seats, totals of the seats we're definitely giving away. Seats that have had votes come in, and on the figures we've got, our algorithm is prepared to give the seat away. And at this stage, the coalition's ahead in enough of their seats to be there, as they're currently on 48.
And can I point out that the ABC is the only place where you'll see this? If you switch to other, by mistake perhaps, switch to other networks this evening, you won't see anything like that?
I wouldn't be prepared to skite on this subject.
Let me do it on your behalf.
They don't have Anthony.
They certainly don't, a national treasure. So, again, they're very early results, but you must be fairly pleased by what you're seeing so far, Gladys.
Oh, it is still too early, Chris, and I remember 4 years...
Luckily there's no drinking game on too early.
Exactly, but I remember 4 years ago, and some of my colleagues still hold it against me, I said, I will never win Campbelltown, and we did. And so Brian Doyle out there said to me, you better not say that again, Gladys. Don't write me off so early. And I think a seat like Campbelltown is really going to be interesting to watch. I mean, that's something you'd assume would go back to the Labor Party tonight. But I'm not going to write that off. And similarly, East Hills. I mean, imagine having a seat on 0.2% to us in an election where we're going to have a huge correction, and to still be talking about East Hills is a fantastic achievement for our candidates in those seats.
Bridget?
Yeah, no, it is interesting, East Hills. I just was listening to Gladys. It's surprising, I suppose, is the 0.2%. Carmel, you'd be surprised by it if it does retain in Liberal hands?
Certainly it was a seat that we would have hoped to pick up, but there's always variations that happen in individual seats that mean the margin is not as relevant as what it is in some other seats, and we may well be seeing that in East Hills. I mean, it's very early in the evening, so let's just see what happens. I've been reliably assured that Cameron Murphy does live in the seat, so I just want to make that clear because there seemed to be a question mark over that. Let's see what happens.
OK, well, in terms of seeing what's happening, let's travel now to the far north coast of New South Wales for a little bit of a run of seats, Bridget.
Well, let's take a look at Lismore first, and that's held by the Nationals' Thomas George. And as we've heard, it's one of the seats that Labor's hoping to pick up. Anthony, what can you tell us about Lismore?
What I can tell you about Lismore is that at this stage, Thomas George is ahead on the first preferences. It's up against Isaac Smith from the Labor Party and Adam Guys from the Greens. At the moment, the Greens are on 26.6, the Labor Party on 25, and Thomas George on 43.8. The figure where they're showing there is the preference count that's coming to us, and it's showing a 23% swing to the Green, to the Labor Party. That is a preference count. Now, if Guys finishes second for the Greens, then that will not be the preference count at the end of the night. That's the figure that comes through. The Commission will continue to feed that count because there's a lot more polling places to come, and they've made their counts based on what it will be at the end of the night. So early on in the night, you will get that hopping around on second and third place. But under optional preferential voting for either Smith or Guys to win, there has to be a strong flow of preferences between the two parties. That's an important factor which is working in the National Party's favour on the North Coast, is some of these seats will see a weak flow of preferences under optional preferential voting.
And if we take a look at Ballina, as we've heard, a lot of these seats on the far north coast, Labor's campaigned heavily up there on the strong opposition to coal seam gas. Ballina, of course, has been held by Don Page for the last 27 years, and it's a huge National Party seat of 24%. But how's it looking tonight?
This is a seat that for several elections has had the Labor majority based on on federal figures. If you I'll stay on the first preferences there and explain again. We're seeing there where the Greens are in second place, Labor's in third. An independent, Jeff Johnson, who's an ex-Greens councillor, is in fourth place there. It will depend on who finishes second. The problem with the National Party is their first preference vote is not high on those numbers. They may be run down. If we go through to the next step, we're seeing a 28% swing to the Labor Party. As I said, and that's not all the votes there, that is again based on that preference count. We'll be waiting to the end of the night to see what order the candidates finish in. But again, the National Party first preference vote is well down in that seat. It's 23% down on first preferences there.
And another safe national seat is Clarence, held by Chris Galaptis. What's happening there?
This is looking much better for the National Party. Chris Galaptis won this at a by-election after the former member Steve Cansdell had to stand aside in the first year of the old Farrell government. 48% for Chris Galaptis there. There is a substantial swing again, something like 24% on the polling places we've got at this stage. But again, 31% margin. So even a 24% swing isn't enough to dislodge the National Party in a seat like that. So on these figures, that looks very promising for the National Party, and they'd be much happier with that number than what they've seen in Clarence or Ballina.
And the ALP also campaigned quite a bit in the coast, in the electorate of Tweed, another national seat held by Jeff Provost.
Yeah, and on these numbers, the National Party vote is holding up at the moment on these numbers. Jeff Provost up against Ron Goodman from the Labor Party. The Greens are on 15% there. And if Jeff Provost can keep his vote up in the mid to high 40s there, he will go on to win the seat. At this stage, we're saying a 16.5%. I've got a later figure, which is 15%. Either way, Jeff Provost would still be elected on those numbers. A lot more counting to come, but certainly that's a seat which is a more traditional two-party contest than neighbouring Clarence and Ballina.
OK, and in some of those seats, Carmel Tibbet, there was a put the Nationals last ticket that was run where all the different smaller parties were preferencing against the National Party.
Yes, that's right, and I think that's something that'll be a feature to watch in this election, what happens with preference flows. We saw a high proportion of exhausted votes in the last election. Part of that related to the poor standing of Labor. I think we'll see a change in that this election, and preferences will be critical.
Gladys?
I'd agree with that. I mean, in the last election, it was pretty much high exhaustion. Greens weren't preferencing. This time, Labor and the Greens are in a we would say, cosy preference deal, and no doubt that will have an impact on some seats, especially in places like the North Coast.
But people have to be animated to do that, don't they? And clearly on the North Coast of New South Wales there really is a serious problem for the government with coal seam gas.
Well, there's no doubt that is a big issue out there, even though we would argue it's a mess that we're cleaning up that we inherited. There's no doubt that and other factors are playing out in those seats, absolutely, and we've known that for a while. But there's also major demographic changes happening in those seats. They're no longer traditional rural and regional seats. They've actually seen a lot of tree changes move in those electorates. So there's a number of fundamental shifts we're seeing, and that's why the result we're getting in tonight is pretty much what we've anticipated, and some of those seats might be too close to call until further on in the night. But there's no doubt that in addition to issues, there are also demographic changes afoot which are compounding the result there.
And certainly there are demographic changes across the state. In fact, we saw the loss of one country seat in the redistribution, which was then the seat of Newtown, then appeared in the middle of Sydney, and that would be quite a big demographic change. Let's have a look at some of the Sydney seats now, Bridget.
Well, let's start first with Manly, and of course this is held by the Premier, Mike Baird. And Anthony, if there's a big swing against Mike Baird, then the government is in trouble.
Let's just look at the numbers. What's interesting is I thought might happen at the moment, the Greens are in second spot in this contest.
I think that'll happen.
Mike Baird against Clara Williams-Roldan. Jennifer Jarry, the Labor Party candidate, is finishing third, but Mike Baird's got 68%. We've got some Brookvale, Manly, DY polling places, 79% after preferences, a small swing to the Labor Party. This is a very safe Conservative seat, though over 60 years of history it has elected a lot of independents. So it's a part of Sydney, 7 miles from Sydney, 1,000 miles from Care.
Yeah, exactly.
It's got its own little area. One of those insular peninsulas which Sydney has.
Let's take a look at Maroubra, and that's the seat held by Michael Daly, who's the Shadow Treasurer. It was the seat of the former Premier, Bob Carr. Anthony, how's that looking tonight?
No difficulties at all for Michael Daly. He had a fight in his hands last time, but this time up against Brendan Roberts from the Liberal Party. The Greens have polled 7.6% there. Michael Daly is leading on first preferences and will go on to win. We've got some preference counts in 2 polling places. I don't think either of them are very representative, but a 12% swing to the Labor Party is what I would have expected in Maroubra tonight. I don't think it's a seat the Liberal Party put nearly the effort into they've put into it in recent years, or to the federal seat of Kingsford Smith in recent years.
And what about Castle Hill? I think it's the 3rd safest Liberal seat. It's held by the Liberals' Ray Williams, but it seems there's been a shift with some of the seats. He was formerly held by Hawkesbury. There's been a bit of confusion about...
Yes, I think there was a bit of confusion that the people were concerned that seats with margins above 30% weren't safe. I don't know why, but there was a swap between the two members, one of those... depends on which branches are in what electorate. So, but Ray Williams had represented large parts of Castle Hill in the past in previous redistributions, wanted to represent the seat, defeated the sitting member. Ray Williams, look, he's still got 84% of the two-party preferred vote, so he's switched over to Castle Hill after a pre-selection contest, and then Dominic Perrottet, who was the former member, switched across to his other electorate.
And also, you mentioned Dominic Perrottet, he's in the seat of Hawkesbury. How's that looking? It's
a very safe seat. There has been a substantial swing to the Labor Party. There was an independent standing here, Kate McInnes, and at this stage she's in 4th position, so she hasn't polled well. Though most of the figures, she was campaigning on a specific issue around Windsor and Richmond, which is the rebuilding of the Windsor Bridge. Those booths aren't in yet, so her vote may pick up later. But at this stage, it looks like Dominic Perrottet has been easily re-returned.
Okay, well, Gladys, one of the things that does distort all this a bit, when you look at some of the margins on which you hold seats, that in fact you could, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it's potential that you could win the two-party preferred vote in the state and actually lose the election, given you've got such large margins in some parts.
Absolutely, and if there was ever an election where it held that, don't look at the swing across the state, look at what's happening in each seat, this is one of those elections, because we're seeing some seats on margins between 8 and 10% in doubt, other seats on less margins potentially hanging on. And so if there was ever an election where you really need to look at regional swings and what's happening in each seat, this is the one, and that's why it's so hard to call.
Yeah, certainly would agree with that. We're just seeing some interesting results here again from Blue Mountains. First 2 significant booths we've seen a swing to Labor of 12.6%. So we are hopeful of that seat. Too early to call, of course, but we are hopeful in that seat.
And that seat's on a margin of 5.4%.
That's
so
right.
you would well and truly have enough if you were getting that kind of result in...
Significant booths they are too.
In the Blue Mountains. OK, well, let's head out to Sydney's outer west, to Campbelltown, Bridget.
And Brian Doyle, the Liberal MP, standing by, and this is the seat, of course, that Gladys said last election that the Liberals could never win. Anthony, what's happening there tonight?
Well, on the figures we've got 7 of the 31 first preference booths and 5 of them 2 candidate preferred, though most of them are external booths, this problem. I've got St Andrews and Thomas Acres. And they're showing that Greg Warren, the Labor Party candidate, is well ahead on 51.7. I'm not saying he'll win with over 50% of the vote. When we factor in the preference swing, the swing that's occurring there, is it's sort of reversing the swing we saw at the last election at this stage, 17.6. I will warn, though, that I haven't got a good smattering of booths that were in the old electorate of Campbelltown. These are from outside of the electorate. So there is a big swing on. This was always going to be a tough seat for for the Liberal Party to retain. At this stage, it looks like it's the Labor Party is favoured in that seat.
Well, let's go now to Campbelltown, and Brian Doyle joins us. Brian Doyle, how are you feeling about the outcome tonight? It's looking very close.
It will be. We won't know till later on tonight, but I'm still quietly optimistic that we can hang on to Campbelltown.
You're a popular candidate, and we've sort of talked about during the campaign that you're the policeman. You've got Greg Warren, a former soldier, up against you. What have been the issues in the seat of Campbelltown?
Campbelltown has been about infrastructure, jobs and connectivity. And in fact, I'm very proud of the fact we've actually put Campbelltown on the map. We're a regional city in the infrastructure plan. And when you look at the infrastructure we've delivered with Campbelltown Stage 1 delivered, the M5 widening delivered, South West Rail Link, Narellan Road widening underway. We've got a very proud record of achievement.
It's traditionally been a safe Labor seat. How concerned are you about tonight that Greg Warren might pick it up? You seem a little bit flat, I have to say.
No, it's well. I was a big believer the people will get it right. The electorate will get the leader, the representation they deserve. I've had a marvellous 4 years. Now you think I gave up a 27-year police career to put Campbelltown back on the map. And I'm surrounded here today by wonderful friends and volunteers who believe in Campbelltown and believe in me. And I'm looking forward to spending some time with them tonight.
And has the poles and wires, the privatisation, been an issue for you in Campbelltown?
Oh, there's no doubt the unions and Labor have run the most outrageous scare campaign in relation to this, and on a whole range of other issues too. And it's easy to scare people, whereas Mike Baird has always been on a positive vein about the future of New South Wales and Campbelltown. And when you look at when we took over, we were dead last in the country. New South Wales is now #1 on all the indicators, and I think we can be very proud of that achievement.
And what was the feedback you were getting from polling booths today?
Oh, it's going to be very tight. There's lots of people I know and bumped into on the way. I'm very confident that we can still do well here.
Well, Brian Doyle, I think it's going to be a tight race. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Yes, well, if energy in the room is any guide, I think that it looks very much like his supporters don't actually believe that race is going to go terribly well tonight. And you can forget, by the way, that all of these people on both sides of the divide, in all political parties, actually do believe in things. And this is an extremely tough night for some people who've put an enormous amount of time and energy into it, and their supporters. And there are very few people in this world who have their jobs measured every 4 years and can be dismissed without any recourse.
Oh, totally agree, Chris, and there's such a human element to this, and I know for a fact Brian has been in Campbelltown door knocking his guts out, so what you saw there is partly exhaustion as well as...
He did look quite flat, though.
Well, it's also the unknown, and I can appreciate that as a candidate, no matter what your margin is, let alone when he's on a knife edge. It's a night where you don't want to come out too early conceding or accepting victory, and so it is a bit of a wait and see, and potentially this is the most critical time. The next hour we'll really see some of these large booths come in and some of the results really firm up in some of these areas. And I think, though, what we saw from Brian was someone who's put his heart and soul into an area for 4 years. He did what we believe to be the undoable in winning the seat of Campbelltown in the first place, putting up a great fight, and I hope for his sake and for the people of Campbelltown that he hangs on. And whilst early figures aren't looking too positive, I learnt 4 years ago not to write that seat off. I made the wrong call. I didn't think we'd win it. We did. And so I'll wait a bit longer before we concede anything there.
And Carmel, a look you saw way too many times in 2011.
That's right, and it is tricky at this stage of the evening for candidates, because if it's not looking good, they have to factor that in and present a demeanour that takes into account, but they never know what's going to happen. They might turn, so they really do have to play it very, very carefully. And it's hard for the supporters as well. I mean, you have people who just work so hard during election campaigns, desperate to get the result they want, doesn't always go their way.
Well, this campaign was one that was actually dominated by issues more than many that have been the case in the last few years. And to discuss that and how the night's going, Juanita Phillips is standing by with Gabrielle Upton, the Minister for Family and Community Affairs.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Chris. Gabrielle Upton sitting here with me now. You're first in the hot seat. Thanks so much for joining us. We don't have a lot of results to talk about just yet, but give me a sense of the mood within the party these past few days. Obviously, all the polls pointing to a coalition victory, but there must have been some real concerns about the swing that was inevitable.
Well, Juanita, we were coming off the back of a high water mark. Of course, 2011 was a big swing in our favour. But look, amongst my colleagues, they have very strongly signed up for this vision, this plan that Mike Baird has put forward. Look, New South Wales is in a good position. We put it back in good budget shape. We now are the leading economic indicator across Australia. We are really the powerhouse, economic powerhouse. And so, you know, good government is about having a plan and a vision for the future. And so, you know, my colleagues are very supportive of that, because that is good government, to take a plan to the electorate and have them then have their say.
OK, so the plan you're talking about, essentially leasing poles and wires to fund a great deal of infrastructure. Tonight's election has been described by both parties as virtually a referendum on that single issue. From what you've been hearing in your electorate, is that the issue that will decide this election?
Well, I've just come back from my electorate and polling booths there, and look, the conversation I was having with people as they were coming to vote was about a broader range of issues. They talk about congestion on the roads, they talk about a better choice of public transport, they talk about schooling for their kids. So although that is an important part of the campaign, there's much more at stake here now. And part of that, of course, will be the kind of infrastructure that we can open up with a mandate that I'm hoping that we will have, although it's too early to call, because it is about unlocking a further investment into schools, hospitals, into the things that I think add to the quality of people's lives here in New South Wales.
Labor has run a very strong scare campaign about power prices going up, foreign ownership. How much do you think that has affected the Liberal vote?
Look, it really shows that old Labor is still around. There's not a positive vision, there's not a plan. And all of that has been scare campaign, scare tactic. And look, from my own electorate, just coming off there an hour and a half ago, that was not the issue they were talking to me about at the polling gate.
And yet the polls do show that 55% of voters in New South Wales are against privatisation, so clearly the Labor campaign has cut through and tapped into some genuine public fears there.
Look, there may be some reservations, Juanita, but the story there is about unleashing investment into infrastructure that adds to the quality of people's lives, that enables them to get to work or to pick up their kids more easily, that gives them the good hospital and the services, and in fact the kind of social dividend that's going to open up. You know, as Minister for Family and Community Services, the Mike Baird government has also been about a very big focus on the vulnerable people in our community, and I know that no better than being the Family and Community Services Minister. And so there's been a strong investment into our frontline services to community, and of course what this long-term lease of poles and wires will do is also open up an opportunity for us to invest and help the most vulnerable members of our community.
There is no guarantee, though, that even if the coalition, as expected, wins government, that you're going to be able to get this plan through the upper house. That's the big unknown, isn't it?
In our last term of government, we worked with the upper house where we didn't have the numbers. I mean, that is always a challenge of government. We would continue to do that. The mandate that, you know, we yet do not and have not secured gives us, I suppose, an opportunity to make those arguments. And again, we don't know the results of the upper house. And we have been able to secure legislation to go through the upper house. Look, it's a wonderful democracy where you have different parties coming out with different issues. They may be single issues. But look, the Mike Baird government is about government across New South Wales across many issues. And again, it goes to the services that people in our local communities need to make their lives better.
All right, Gabrielle Upton, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Anita.
You're watching New South Wales Votes coming to you live from the ABC Election Centre in Ultimo. And what you can see there is our technology desk. It's there that the raw data from the New South Wales Electoral Commission flows into our highly trained technicians who take that mud and fashion it into Ming vases for Anthony Green to use. And Anthony, let's have a bit of a look around the state.
Yes. My mind moulds the data a bit as well. You know. All right, so let's have a look at the overall figures for the election. 35.7 for the Liberals, 9.6 for the Nationals. So that's above 46%. So that's a very encouraging figure for the coalition this time of night. 35% for the Labor, which is what the polls are saying. 10.8 for the Greens, 8.7. That figure's coming down a little bit as some of the city figures are coming in, because most of the bigger independents are in the country. If we look at the change in vote that's occurring, what we're seeing is the Liberal vote down 3, Nationals down 3, Labor up 9.6, the Greens up slightly, and the others are down. There's fewer independents, half the number of independents in this election, and I don't think some of the other parties which are running have really attracted that sort of vote. Now, we want to look at the chamber as well. This is what we're going to fill in for the seats that we're definitely giving away to one side or the other. We're giving Liberals 35, Nationals 16, which is getting them up to 51, 30 for Labor, 1 Green and 2 others, and I'll come to the Greens in just a moment. If we lean a few seats leaning either way, that gets the Liberals up to 52 and Labor up to 31. Now, what I have, I thought I'd bring up the seats, inner city Green seats for the first time. Very slow count in both Balmain and Newtown. Obviously, very heavy scrutineering going on, as you would expect. The first figures for Balmain, 1.6. The Greens are ahead of Verity Firth and the Liberals on 23. The key thing that's occurring in this election, and was always likely to happen, the Liberal vote down, the Labor vote up, and the Green vote up. The Liberals astonishingly finished first in Balmain last time, and the Labor Party fell to third, and that's why the Greens won the seat. If the Liberal vote fell, it was always going to make it a Labor versus Green contest, and that's what we're seeing at the moment, but we have only 1.6% of the vote, so it can't be called. And Newtown, which is Team Jenny versus Team Penny, as it's been known locally. And again, the Liberals are finishing third there. This is a composite electorate. It's taken the eastern end of the old Marrickville, which is a Labor-Green contest. It's taken Redfern, which was a Labor-Liberal contest. And it's taken Surrey Hills, which was an independent versus Liberal contest that used to be in Sydney. So it's very difficult to come up with any sensible figures overall for this. But the Greens are ahead. I'm not sure where all the figures are from, but if you look at the change in vote that's occurring at this stage, Labor vote up, the Green vote up, Liberal vote down, others down, but there's a lot more counting to come in that electorate. It's a very peculiar little electorate.
Okay, so Newtown and Balmain, places that you keep an eye on, changed a lot over Balmain in particular over the last 20 years or so. I remember driving past on the Iron Cove Bridge, past the old Colgate factory that was there. It used to be a working class area, isn't anymore. But you're hopeful with Verity Firth that you might have the candidate to bring it back.
Well, Verity was a very popular member when she was last the member. She was obviously impacted by the statewide swing against Labor in 2011. She's campaigned extraordinarily hard during this election. I'm very hopeful that she'll get there. Preferences are going to be critical, and I know that the Greens have been handing out a preference card asking people if they're voting Liberal to vote Greens number 2. So let's see what impact that has.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see the Green vote generally throughout metropolitan Sydney. I'm going to predict that in some areas such as Northern Beaches, North Shore, Inner West potentially, that the Greens will keep taking votes from Labor, and so for them that exchange of preferences is so critical. But I can see actually in some polling booths around safer parts of Liberal territory, the Greens outpolling Labor, which hasn't happened before to this extent. So I think watching what happens to the Green vote and subsequently the preferences will be really interesting, not just for this election but for the future.
And speaking of that Green vote, when we look at the North Coast seats, at Lismore doing well and Ballina in the Green vote, how are the Nationals feeling going into this?
Well, I think some of that a high level of Green vote represents changing demographics, but I also think it demonstrates a question marks over what people think the Labor Party stands for, because when the Green vote goes up, traditionally they're taking away from the Labor Party. They tend not to take away from the Liberal base. And so I think there are some question marks around, well, we're not quite sure where the Labor Party stands for, so we'll vote for the Greens instead. And these are people who will never vote Liberal. They're not going to vote for Liberal ever, for the Liberal Party ever. And so now they are flirting with the vote. And I think that trend might be something to watch tonight and also future elections.
But around the country as well, Carmel Tebbit, the Greens are cannibalising the Labor Party's vote. They are actually running against you in these inner city seats and doing a reasonable job.
And not just in Australia. I mean, this is something that social democratic parties are facing across the world. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge for Labor. Now, I am hopeful in Balmain and Newtown that Labor will retain that, or will take those seats. But over the longer term, this is going to be a big challenge that Labor is going to address.
And tough for the Labor Party, because the Labor Party is a party of government, so it does have to actually draw a centre line on some things.
That's right, and the Labor Party's a broad church, and within that broad church you've got people who go from the right through to the left. So it is a difficult one, but increasingly important as we see the Green vote increase in parts of the country.
All right, well, let's have a look down in Sydney's southeast at the Sutherland Shire.
And Chris, let's go first to Heathcote, which is held by the Liberals' Lee Evan. Anthony, what's happening there tonight?
Well, this is a seat which moved up into the Metropolitan, has taken in more of the Sutherland Shire and become safer for the Liberal Party. And at this stage of the night, it appears that that's assisted the Liberal Party. Lee Evans is on 46.3, the Labor Party on 31, the Greens 12.5. We've got preference counts in a number of booths, including a number of large external ones. At this stage, it's turning into a swing of 15.8, which is a big swing. Puts the seat back to its more marginal status, and it should be a marginal seat, really. Heathcote had an inflated majority. At this stage, they're good figures for Lee Evans from the Liberal Party. And if we go to Cronulla, that's held by Mark Speakman, a safe Liberal seat. And it remains a safe Liberal seat. This is a seat, I think the only time it fell, Michael Egan was the only Labor member who's held it in modern times during the high point of the Rann era. And at this stage, it's only a 4% swing to the Labor Party. And Mark Speakman, who was elected for the first time last time, will be returned as the member in that seat. And if we take a look at Miranda as well, what are you expecting to happen there? It's held by Peter Collier, won that at the by-election in 2011. Well, we've got 7% counted, lots of small booths, which is the way you often get, and you've got a couple of the external booths which are all outside of the electorate. At this stage, they're showing a very strong vote for the Liberal Party, and nothing like the 26% swing we saw at the by-election. So this has been even strengthened on the new boundaries. So at this stage, it looks like Eleni I think it's, what's the pronunciation here? Eleni Petanos is the new member for Miranda at this stage.
All right, well, we were speaking a little bit earlier about some bellwether seats. When you look at federal elections, you always look at the seat of Eden-Monaro. In the New South Wales election, it is the seat of Monaro. 25 out of 28 times, this seat has gone with government. So, Brisbane? If we look at Monaro, as you mentioned, it's held by the Nationals' John Barilaro, and he's standing by. We're going to talk to him in a moment. But first, let's just get a look at that seat, Anthony, tonight. How's it going?
Well, on the numbers I have, we're going to be here all night, but perhaps John Barilaro will have better numbers. He's up against Steve Wan, who used to hold the seat, and his father used to be the federal member many years ago in the Whitlam government era. And on those numbers, John Barilaro is ahead. Now, there's some of the Queanbeyan booths, one of the first ones is in, but not two-party preferred. At this stage, on the 6 polling places we have a preference count from, there's a very small swing to the National Party. So on the 6 booths we've got, admittedly small, there is no swing occurring in that electorate, basically, and that's a very good sign for John Barilaro on the early figures, but the big Queanbeyan booths to come.
OK, well, let's have a chat to John Barilaro. Thanks for joining us. You've just heard what Anthony said. Is that the feedback you're getting? He said that you may have better numbers than he does.
Oh, no, not really. They are the smaller booths from outside of Queanbeyan. A couple of the Queanbeyan booths have come in, and they're strong as well. We're not seeing a lot of movement from 2011. For me, it's early. It's very early stages, and in 2011 we know this took to about Tuesday or Wednesday to get the final results. So I'm yet to jump at the results. There's plenty to come, and it's just going to be a long night, I think, here in the Monaro.
You mentioned you're waiting for those votes from Queanbeyan to come. A lot of public service, public sector, people that hold public sector jobs there. The Tony Abbott factor, are you expecting that to hit you?
Yeah, look, definitely. I mean, the Tony Abbott factor, the federal government factor has played over the border. There's no question about that, and the Labor Party and the unions have used it. There's billboards. It's quite flattering to be alongside of Tony Abbott, but being a state member and a national member makes no sense. But they've played to that here. They've played to it hard. But our grassroots campaigning on the ground, talking to voters, hopefully we'll overcome those federal issues, because we've got a good news story to tell in the Monero, a good news story to tell in New South Wales. That's what we've been trying to do, and I've pitched forward a vision over the next 4 years what I can do if Mike Baird is returned as Premier this evening as part of a Baird Liberal government.
And what about the poles and wires privatisation? It is more unpopular in regional areas than it is in city seats. How much has that been a factor?
Yeah, look, it has been an issue on the ground, but for those that have followed the debate on poles and wires, it was I that stood up in relation to the issue against my own government at the time when we had to debate the issue. That's how we excluded Essential Energy as part of the deal, 100% government owned, and 49% of the metropolitan poles and wires now will be leased, and the regions will still see $6 billion. So I've got a good story to tell on poles and wires, because I stood up for this community, and the compromise outcome has actually been not only a great victory for the regional New South Wales, which includes the Monero, but a great outcome in relation to the debate overall.
It's a seat that both leaders have been campaigning in throughout the last 4 weeks. It's very tight though. How are you sort of feeling about it?
Look, very anxious. I was up quite early this morning with a 2% margin since 2011. Of course, you cannot go into this election not feeling that a bit of a correction would be coming in play. There would be a swing, but we have fought hard on the ground. And look, it's taken a lot of campaigning. When I was elected in 2011, I started campaigning from day one, 4 years ago. Over the last 6 months, I've had an army of volunteers on the ground. Each and every one of them are working for this campaign, putting forward a positive message, the good news story that New South Wales has in underpinning what is actually on the backdrop of what's happening nationally. So look, it's going to be a long night. We're not going to get an early result this evening and at the moment, but look, I'm comfortable where I'm at right now.
John Barilaro, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, and if there was going to be a Tony Abbott effect anywhere in New South Wales, you would imagine it would be on the border of Canberra. There have been a whole lot of public service jobs that have been lost there. So John Barilaro probably has a number of things working against him. One, public service job cuts in Canberra, which will affect those booths in Queanbeyan, and poles and wires in that part of regional New South Wales, which will bite fairly deeply, you would think.
But Chris, again, a candidate, a member, a minister who's only on 2% but holding up. I mean, that should have been a seat which the Labor Party should have put in the bag, early on in the evening, but we're still in there with a shot. And John Barilaro is one of the most outstanding campaigners you'll ever see. He's run a very strong grassroots campaign, notwithstanding all the challenges in that area. And of course, his seat is in close proximity to cross-border issues and other issues which impact him. I'll be interested to see how some of the larger Queanbeyan booths fare when those results come in. So at the moment, some of the results coming in are not from Queanbeyan themselves, but he's holding up really well on a margin of just 2%, which is really good, as are some of our other candidates in some of the other seats. So I'm getting really positive feedback about Oatley. That's a seat that's on just 3.8%, and apparently we're having swings to us in some of the booths in Oatley, and it looks like Mark Curray will again be the member there. He's fought a very strong campaign. East Hills I'm getting positive messages about. Again, a seat only on 0.2%. Holsworthy was a seat I was wanting to look at, and I'm really pleased that Mel Gibbons, our member there, is doing so well. That's a seat again that really changed from a seat based around the Shire to one based around parts of Liverpool and Western Sydney, and the fact that Holsworthy is looking so good for us at this stage is a positive. I'm willing to predict that Miranda will be a seat we actually win off the Labor Party, and Eleni Petnos will make a great member for Miranda, another young woman coming into the New South Wales Parliament, hopefully. And somewhere like Heathcote, which traditionally was regarded as a very marginal seat, we're seeing tonight, and I think in the last few weeks, a really shoring up of that seat. Lee Evans has done a really good job of digging himself in 4 years ago, and that seat was was one which traditionally you may have said would be in doubt, but we're happy to say that that's a seat we think will hold.
So, Carmel Tebbit, what are you hearing? You would have thought that Monero would be one of those seats that you could put in the bag fairly early in the night if things were going your way.
I think we have to take into account that, the swing is not uniform across the state. Monero is a bellwether seat, so while it's on a very small margin. It's a seat that usually goes with government. Now, if we're not picking up government this time round, it's not likely that we're going to get Monero, even though we've got a very good candidate there with Steve Wan. So I think that needs to be kept in play, but we need to factor in that bellwether status of that seat. But we are still getting very good results in the Blue Mountains, where we're seeing our candidate now on about, I'm being told 59% of the vote, which seems extraordinary. Let's wait and see what comes in or what Anthony's telling us. But good results in Wyong as well. I think that we will take Wyong for Labor. So the outcome's not uniform across the state, but there's some seats that we're doing well in.
So Blue Mountains and Wyong, you were not nodding there, so you think that they're probably going the other way?
Yeah, I mean, Rosa Sage is a great member of Parliament in the Blue Mountains, and I think she's struggling to hold on to the seat tonight, but it's always been tight. She's done an amazing job, but there are some factors in that seat which could see us potentially lose that seat, and so it is early days, but that is one we may not hold on to.
OK, look, we might go now to the Hunter, where we are seeing some movement. Bridget?
Yeah, let's take a look at Swansea, and that's held by Gary Edwards, and he's an independent. He was a Liberal, but he was forced to the crossbenches when he was involved in ICAC property developer donations. Anthony, what's happening in Swansea?
Well, he's the only one of those members mentioned in the inquiry that's proceeded to go ahead and run at the election, and at the moment he's polled respectively well for an independent. Some of these independents who are run again tend to, I'm thinking of Peter Slipper and a few others who've done particularly badly, but Gary Edwards is polling 16% of the vote there. At this stage, he's looking like a safe Labor gain, which is not at all surprising. It was quite a one-off result for the Liberal Party last time, a swing of 13%. And Yasmin Catley, who's the wife of the former member for the seat, and she's easily won that seat and will be a new member of Parliament for the Labor Party.
OK, we'll also take a look at Maitland and what's happening in Maitland.
Well, this is where the Liberal member, Robin Parker, retired. The new Liberal candidate is Steve Thompson against Jenny Aitchison. And on the numbers we're seeing at the moment, this is a very strong, it's a 41.9 for Labor, 25. There's an independent there, 22.3, Philip Penfold. He's polling quite well. Now, our numbers here are going on to say there's a big swing there. I'd want to see a few more votes in. That's Maitland Town Hall and Millers Forest Public. I'd want to see a bit more vote in, but that's looking promising for the Labor Party, as long as I think that's looks like the Labor Party has won that seat.
OK, and Wallsend, that's held by Sonia Hornery for the Labor Party. Is she going to hang on, do you think?
And as we're seeing with the number of Labor seats, there's actually a substantial swing to the Labor Party in the Labor seats. With a problem for the Labor Party, there are seats like East Hills which aren't displaying that swing. The Labor Party, 59.7 on first preferences. Hannah Reeves was a university student, law student. I think she's 22. She was one of the last candidates announced, sent it to Tiger Country for the party. And it's a very safe Labor seat, Wallsend.
And Port Stephens, Craig Bowman holds it, but he's retiring due to ICAC. What's happening?
Sorry.
No, you're right.
And this is a very interesting result because Craig Bowman won this in 2007, so it fell the year before when the Yemma government was re-elected. The Liberals are ahead, Labor's on 43.6. We've got a fair number of preference counts in at this stage, and it's showing a swing of 18.6%. That's a fifth. Puts the Labor Party ahead, and I think the Labor Party's Kate Washington, who ran last time, so she's having the second go at the seat. I think she's likely, I think she has won the seat. I'll just say two things about the swings that are going on. The swing is getting to 6 and 7%, and the seats on that margin are falling. It's the swing seats on 8 to 10 which are not falling. There's a couple of seats up on 12 and 13 which are falling, but not enough to compensate. That's why the government's been re-elected. And the second thing on the swing in Sydney is 8.5%. The swing in the country is 10, but the swing in the Hunter and the Illawarra is 15%. What that suggests to me is what's happened is that the poles and wire issue has shored up Labor's base in the Hunter and the Illawarra, and that's where the biggest impact has been. The same occurred in the 1991 election when the Greiner government lost its majority, was that the biggest swings were in the areas in the Hunter and the Illawarra, and I think the similar thing has afflicted the Labor vote at this election.
All right, well, Wyong was one of those seats on the Central Coast which fell to the Liberal Party in the landslide of 2011. What's happening there tonight, Bridget?
Yes, well, our reporter Jackson Vernon is there with David Harris, who's the ALP candidate. He's actually a former member. We're going to cross to Jackson and David in a minute, but Anthony, Just let's have a look at Wyong and what's happening this evening.
Well, this was a marginal seat. This is a seat that had always been Labor held previously before the last election. It was won by Darren Webber, but he was one of those candidates who fell foul of whether donations had been made which allowed them to be paid money while they were a candidate, and he had to stand aside Sandra Kerr as a new Liberal candidate. David Harris was the Labor MP for the seat from 2007 to 2011, so he's had a lot of name recognition, and that's certainly paid in his favour. It was only a marginal seat. The swing is just under 12%, so David Harris is the new returned as a Labor member for Wyong.
And there's cheers there, Jackson Vernon and David Harris. Jackson, obviously, and David, he'd be very excited at the moment.
Hi Bridget, yes, no, there's an excited crowd behind us at the moment. There's strong results coming through for David Harris. David joins me now. Those early results coming through, is it too early to call the seat?
Look, it's looking more and more now like I will win the seat. I'm very, very happy with the way the campaign's run. I'm very happy about the way our team has worked in the last few weeks, and particularly today. It looks like we will have a victory.
What were voters telling you over the election campaign were those key issues to you?
Look, the key issues have been power privatisation, they've been the attacks to TAFE, but locally it's been issues like Wallara 2, what's happened with ICAC. There's been a range of issues. This is a changing seat. It's actually on paper becoming more and more Liberal, but we've had a very strong result today.
Obviously, this was one of the several seats across the Central Coast and the Hunter region which were embroiled in the corruption scandal at the ICAC. How much do you think the events at the ICAC last year impacted or, I guess, affected voter behaviour?
Look, people want to be able to trust their local member, and at the moment there's a very low trust in the community. What we're seeing across the Central Coast with a strong Labor vote is people actually coming back to Labor, knowing that local people concerned with local issues is very, very important.
You lost the seat at the 2011 election to Darren Webber, who was one of the MPs caught up in the corruption scandal. Seeing that play out and knowing that you'd lost the seat in those circumstances, how did that make you feel, and was that a motivation for you this election?
Look, I was devastated. A lot of people told me that they didn't vote against me at the last election. They voted against the Labor brand. That I was someone they could trust. The Liberals were giving a real privilege representing the seat of Wyong for the first time ever in a landslide victory, and they blew it. They really did blow it. They've really killed trust with people in the local area. I'm about delivering that trust back to the local community, but most of all it's about unfinished business. It's about me getting on with the job that I left before, making sure that this growing area of Wyong gets the resources that it needs.
It was the first time that the seat was handed to the Liberal Party. It must have been a fairly crushing defeat for you.
Look, on the night I apologised to our supporters. I said we fought hard over 4 years, but on that day I felt like it was a knife through the heart in terms of my Labor loyalty, and I've worked for 4 years very, very hard to return the seat not just to the Labor Party but to community values that I think are really important and that former Labor members have always had in the seat of Wyong.
So 4 years on and looking likely you're going to be returning to Parliament, do you feel vindicated at all?
I feel vindicated in a way that people have trusted that I've kept up my hard work in the community. This area's been without a sitting member virtually for 18 months, and I've been working around the community on different issues, trying to fill that gap. Telling people that they know that if I was elected again, that I would be putting their interests first, not those of Macquarie Street, but those of the people of Wyong. And I think today we've been rewarded for that. We now have to build on this across the state. Labor is coming back from a very bad election loss last time. We have to build trust and move on from here and gain government so that the people get the services and the government that they deserve in this state.
The other big issue in the area was the Wallara 2 coal mine. What were voters telling you about this? Were they outraged or were they supportive of it?
Look, voters are outraged that they were given a no ifs, no buts promise that legislation would be moved to stop the mine forever. That's what Barry O'Farrell told them at a meeting at Marty. That was the written guarantee that was given by former Minister Harcher. And people have a low opinion of politicians already. But what the Liberals showed was that they could make a major promise like that win votes, get the community actually campaigning on their behalf, and then go out and totally backflip on their promise. I'm not about backflips, I'm about carrying through what I did. I tried to stop the mine the first time, which we did with that application, and I'll be working very hard to stop it this time.
David, I have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.